Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On a night more than 3,000 years gone, in a city on the coast of Asia Minor whose walls had held for 10 long years against the largest army the Bronze Age world had ever gathered on a single stretch of sand, the men of Troy did a thing that every version of the story agrees on, and that no sober explanation has ever fully redeemed. They opened their own gates, with their own hands, and dragged inside them a wooden horse the size of a house, a thing their enemies had built and left behind on the empty beach, and they did it in the middle of a festival of relief and wine and weeping joy, because the ships were gone, actually gone, sailed away over the rim of the sea after 10 years of siege, and the war. Everyone told each other that evening the war was over, and Troy, against every reasonable expectation of the previous decade, had won. There was music in the city that night. There was wine poured out in the temples in thanksgiving, and wine poured out in the streets in celebration. And there were old men who had buried sons in the 10th year of the siege, who stood at last on their own walls and wept for a different reason than they had wept in the spring. And somewhere in the dark heart of that wooden horse, if the story is true, and we will have a great deal to say before this night is over about whether it is true, there sat a small number of Greek soldiers, cramped and silent and sweating in the dark, listening to the sounds of a city's joy through a hull of pine planking, waiting for the single signal that would end it. We're not going to rush to that signal tonight. That is not how this channel tells a story, and the Trojan War, more than almost any story we have ever taken up in this room, punishes the teller who rushes, because it is not one story at all. It is a tangle of stories, wound together over more than 1,000 years by poets who never met each other, and soldiers and priest-kings whose names have crumbled off their own monuments. A tangle that begins in the smoky, half-legendary courts of the late Bronze Age, passes through 400 years of silence so total that we call it, correctly, a Dark Age, and comes out the other side as the two greatest poems the Greek language ever produced. Poems that a blind singer, or a school of singers working under one remembered name, shaped out of centuries of half-forgotten memory into something that has not stopped being read, recited, translated, adapted and believed in one way or another, for going on 3,000 years. And underneath the poems we now know, and did not know for most of those 3,000 years, there is a mound of dirt on a hillside above the Dardanelles in what is now Turkey, that a stubborn, half-honest, half-fraudulent German businessman started digging into with far too little care in the 1870s, and inside that mound, layer under layer under layer, like the pages of a book bound upside down and out of order, there is a city, or rather 9 cities, one built on the ruins of the last, one of which really did burn in a real fire at more or less the right time, for reasons that were almost certainly not a woman's face and a wooden horse. So let us say the thesis plainly here at the very beginning, the way we like to on this channel, so that you know the shape of the night that is coming. This is a story about the strange, essential, very human way that memory becomes myth. It is the story of how something did happen on that windswept, wine-dark coast, in a world of bronze swords and chariots and palace kings, whose scribes kept meticulous inventories of olive oil and wool, but never once, that we have found, wrote down the name of a woman called Helen, and how the something that happened, whatever it truly was, a raid, a trade war, a siege, a slow and grinding collapse that took a whole civilization down with it, passed through 4 centuries of firelit nights with no writing at all, no ledgers, no inscriptions, nothing but voices telling it to other voices, and came out transformed, the way water becomes ice, into 10 years of divine intervention and human grief, and the single most famous horse in the history of the world. It is a story about what a society chooses to remember when everything else about it is lost, and about the terrible, beautiful unfairness of the fact that we know the name of Achilles and do not know the name of a single ordinary woman who was carried off in chains from a burning city on the coast of Anatolia in the 12th century before Christ, though there were, without question, thousands of her. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe. but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, and let yourself ease into the tale of the Trojan War. The most famous war that may never have happened quite the way anyone has ever told it, and of the city on the hill above the strait, and of the horse, and of everything the horse has come to mean. To understand a war that lasted in the poems 10 years, and that has now been told and retold for something like 3,000 more, we cannot begin with the horse, and we cannot even begin with Helen. We have to begin with the world that made such a story possible in the first place, a world we call, for lack of any name its own people left us, the late Bronze Age Aegean, because it was a world already old by the time the poems remember it, a world of gold-masked kings and armoured charioteers and towering stone citadels, a world that stood, in the centuries before the war the poems describe, at the very height of a civilization we did not even know it existed until men started digging up its graves. And it was the meeting of that particular world, proud and brittle and already beginning, in ways nobody inside it could have seen, to crack with a war, real or exaggerated or partly invented, fought over a strait that controlled the traffic of the whole eastern Mediterranean, that produced the memory this whole night's story is built from. A different war, in a different age, would have been forgotten the way 10,000 other Bronze Age skirmishes were forgotten. This one was not. And so it is with that world. The world before the war, the world of Mycenae and Wilusa and the great empire of the Hittites that stood behind it all like a shadow. The poems barely mention that our story properly begins. A world of lion gates and golden masks. The Greece that would one day launch 1,000 ships, in the poet's famous phrase, was not, in the centuries before the war, anything like the Greece of later fame, the Greece of marble temples and philosophers arguing in open colonnades and citizens voting in an assembly. That Greece lay 800 years and more in the future. The Greece of the Trojan War, the Greece the poems call, with a memory that had already gone hazy by the time anyone wrote it down, Achaea, was a world of small, fiercely independent, heavily fortified kingdoms, each one built around a hilltop citadel of massive stone, walls so thick and so roughly hewn, from blocks the size of small houses that the Greeks of 1,000 years later, looking up at the ruins of those same walls, could not believe men had built them, and said instead that they must have been raised by the one-eyed giants of legend, the Cyclopes, because no ordinary human labour seemed sufficient to the stone. We call the whole civilization Mycenaean now, after the greatest of those citadels, Mycenae, whose lion gate still stands today, 2 carved beasts rearing on either side of a column that has stood in the Greek sun for more than 3,000 years, and whose name Homer would give, centuries later, to the king who led the whole expedition against Troy, Agamemnon, rich in gold, lord of men, and it is one of the small, satisfying certainties of this whole uncertain story that when a German excavator broke into the shaft graves inside those walls in the 1870s and found a dead man's face covered in a mask of beaten gold, so fine and so haunting that it has become one of the most reproduced images in the whole history of archaeology, he sent a telegram to the King of Greece that has become, itself, part of the legend, in which he announced, with more confidence than the evidence could support, and rather more poetry than a scholar should permit himself, that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. He had not. The mask was centuries too old for any king the poems could plausibly describe. But the confusion tells you something true about this whole story, before we have even properly begun it, which is that the wish to touch the myth directly, to put a hand on the actual gold and say, here, this is him, has been driving the archaeology of this war since the very first shovel went into the ground. These Mycenaean kingdoms, Mycenae and Pylos and Tiryns and Thebes and a dozen others, whose names the poems half remember and half invent, were not a single nation in any sense a modern person would recognise. They shared a language, an early form of Greek that we can now read, thanks to one of the great detective triumphs of 20th century scholarship, because it was written down, not in the alphabet we would recognise, but in a syllabic script of nearly 90 symbols that modern scholars call Linear B, incised by palace scribes into small clay tablets that were never meant to survive, that were baked hard and preserved for 3,000 years only by the accident of the very fires that destroyed the palaces that made them. They shared gods, many of whose names, Zeus and Poseidon and Hera and Dionysus, appear already unmistakably in those Bronze Age tablets, centuries before a single line of Homer was composed, proof that the religion of the epics was not invented by the poets, but inherited by them from a world already ancient in their own time, and they shared, or so the poems insist and the archaeology cautiously allows, a habit of fighting each other, kingdom against kingdom, raid against raid, in a world where the sea was not a barrier but a highway, and a warband that could put 100 ships on the water could strike almost anywhere on the Aegean coast with a speed no land army of the age could match. It was a warrior aristocracy, much as the frontier Spain of another of our knights was a warrior aristocracy, a world in which the highest thing a man could win was not wealth, quietly accumulated but glory seized in a single dazzling stroke, a spear thrown true, a city sacked, a name that would outlive the body that earned it. And if you remember that from our other stories, hold on to it now, because it is going to matter again before this night is over. And across the sea from these small, proud, quarrelsome Greek kingdoms, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, there stood another world entirely, a world the Mycenaeans traded with and fought with and married into, and the poems will insist, eventually destroyed. The world of Anatolia, and behind it, filling most of the map of the Bronze Age Near East, the great empire of the Hittites, a power whose existence Western scholars did not even properly credit until the early 20th century, when archaeologists began pulling clay tablets by the thousand out of a royal archive in central Turkey, and slowly, painstakingly, learned to read a language that had been dead and utterly unremembered for more than 3,000 years. The Hittite kings ruled an empire that rivaled Egypt, that fought Egypt to a standstill at one of the largest chariot battles in the history of the ancient world, at a place called Kadesh, and signed with the pharaoh Rameses II one of the earliest peace treaties in human history, a document so significant that a copy of it hangs today in enlarged replica on the wall of the United Nations. And in the far western corner of that Hittite world, on the edge of empire, close enough to the coast to see the ships, and far enough from the Hittite capital to govern itself under its own local kings so long as it paid its tribute and kept its treaties, there lay a small vassal kingdom whose name appears, again and again, in the clay tablets of the Hittite archive, spelled in ways that Hittite scribes rendered variously across the centuries, but that modern scholars, comparing the sounds with painstaking care, have come to believe was pronounced something very like Wilusa. We're going to come back to Wilusa, and to what the Hittite tablets actually say about it, much later in this story, because it belongs to the part of the tale that took the world 3,000 years to uncover, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend this early in the evening that anyone in the Bronze Age itself thought of that little vassal kingdom as the setting for a war that would echo down the centuries. To them, if it existed at all in anything like the way the poems remember it, it was a border dispute, a trade rivalry, a strategic choke point on a strait that controlled the passage of every ship moving between the Aegean and the grain-rich shores of the Black Sea, important certainly, worth fighting over certainly, but not yet the stuff of legend. The stuff of legend, the story that would outlive the Bronze Age itself by 3,000 years and counting, had not yet been told. It had not even happened yet, if it happened at all. But the world that would tell it, and the world it would be told about, were already standing in the centuries before our story truly opens, gold-masked and lion-gated on one shore, walled and tributary and watchful on the other, waiting, though nothing in the record suggests they knew it, for the war that would outlive them both, a quarrel among goddesses. Every long war in the telling wants a single cause, a single spark that lit the whole conflagration, and the Trojan War was given, by the poets who told it, one of the strangest and most human causes any war has ever been given. A beauty contest among three goddesses, judged by a shepherd on a mountainside who did not know, when he woke that morning, that he was a prince. The story runs like this, and we will tell it the way it was told, without apology, because a myth deserves to be heard whole before it is questioned. At the wedding of a sea nymph named Thetis to a mortal king named Peleus, a marriage arranged, uneasily by the gods themselves, after a prophecy warned that Thetis was destined to bear a son greater than his father, every god and goddess of Olympus was invited to the feast, every one, that is, but Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, whose name means, in Greek, exactly what you would expect it to mean, and who was left off the guest list for the plain and understandable reason that no one wants strife at a wedding. Eris came anyway, uninvited, the way strife always does, and she came bearing a single golden apple, inscribed in some tellings with the words for the fairest, and she rolled it into the middle of the feast and vanished, and left behind her the single most expensive argument in the history of Greek mythology, because three goddesses, Hera the queen of Olympus, Athena the goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite the goddess of love and desire, each claimed the apple as her own, and none of the other gods, wisely, would agree to judge between three such formidable women, and so the task was handed down by Zeus himself, who wanted no part of it, to a mortal, a young man tending sheep on the slopes of Mount Ida above the city of Troy, a prince named Paris who did not yet know he was a prince at all. Paris, the story says, had been exposed on that mountainside as an infant, left to die on the orders of his own father, King Priam of Troy, because a prophecy at his birth had warned that this child would one day bring the ruin of the city, a fire carried in his mother's dream before he was even born, a burning torch that set all of Troy ablaze. The servant given the terrible order to abandon the baby on the mountain could not bring himself to finish the killing, and left the child instead to whatever mercy the mountain might show him. And the mountain, in the way of these stories, showed mercy, and a shepherd found him, and raised him as his own. And the boy who would one day be blamed, more than any single human being in the whole tangled story, for the fall of the greatest city of his age, grew up tending sheep on the very slopes where the city he did not know was his home could be seen, small and pale in the valley below. It is worth pausing on that here at the beginning, because it is the first of the story's many warnings that go unheeded, a pattern we're going to meet again and again before this night is over. The prophecy was given, and believed enough that a king ordered his own son killed to prevent it, and the killing was not carried out, and the son grew to manhood in ignorance of exactly the doom he had been born to cause, and the very failure of mercy to become murder is what let the doom, in the end, walk right back through the gates of the city that had tried to keep it out. It was to this shepherd, then, that the three goddesses came, each one, the story says, offering him a bribe more dazzling than the last. Hera offered him power, kingship over the whole of Asia, dominion beyond what any prince of Troy could otherwise dream of. Athena offered him wisdom and mastery in war, victory in every battle he ever fought, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, offered him something more intimate and more ruinous than either, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, who was young, and who had spent his whole short life on a mountainside with nothing to occupy his mind but sheep and his own imagination, chose Aphrodite, and gave her the apple, and in doing so he did two things at once, though he understood in that moment only one of them. He made an enemy, forever, of two of the most powerful goddesses on Olympus, Hera and Athena both, who would spend the following 10 years of war working patiently and with divine malice for the destruction of the city Paris was born to save, and he claimed his prize, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, a woman who was not, as it happened, unmarried, and not, as it happened, remotely free to be given away. Her name was Helen, and she was, by every account the Greeks ever told of her, the daughter of Zeus himself, who had come to her mother Leda in the form of a swan, and she had grown up in the palace of Sparta into a beauty so celebrated that when she came of marriageable age, every king and prince of note in the Greek world travelled to her father's court to seek her hand. A gathering so large and so dangerous, so many proud and powerful men crowded into one hall, all wanting the same prize, that her stepfather, the king of Sparta, feared for his own safety and the peace of Greece itself if he simply chose one suitor and turned the rest away in anger. It was a clever, unproven young prince from the island of Ithaca, a man named Odysseus, who solved the problem, though he himself was not among the serious contenders for Helen's hand, and had come, in truth, hoping to win the hand of her cousin instead. And it is worth noting this early, that the cleverest man in the whole story enters it first not as a warrior, but as a diplomat, because that is exactly the kind of man he will turn out to be for the rest of this long tale. Odysseus proposed that before Helen's father made his choice, every suitor in that crowded hall should swear a solemn oath that whoever was chosen, all the rest would defend the marriage against any man who tried to steal the bride away by force, that an injury to the winner's marriage would be treated as an injury to every man who had sworn the oath, bound together forever by the swearing of it. The suitors agreed, relieved to have a way to save face, and swore the oath over the cut pieces of a sacrificed horse. And Helen's father, once the oath was safely sworn and every dangerous man in the room bound to honour whatever choice he made, gave his daughter's hand to Menelaus, a solid, capable, unspectacular Greek king who would inherit through this marriage the throne of Sparta itself. Remember that oath. Write it down, in your mind, the way we ask you to remember certain details in every story we tell on this channel, because everything that follows from it, the 1,000 ships, the 10 years, the whole vast catastrophe, hangs on a promise a room full of ambitious young men made to save themselves an argument, never once imagining it would call them, years later, away from their own kingdoms and their own families to die on a foreign shore for another man's wife. It is one of the oldest and truest observations this kind of story can offer, and we will meet it again before the night is over in other forms. The oath sworn lightly in a moment of convenience has a way of coming due at the worst possible hour, with interest no one thought to calculate. The judgment of Paris and the oath of the suitors belong, properly, to the realm of pure myth, and we should say so plainly here at the beginning, rather than letting you discover it later and feel misled. No Bronze Age tablet has ever recorded a golden apple, no clay archive has ever mentioned a shepherd, prince judging a beauty contest on a mountainside, and the whole business of gods rewarding mortals with kingdoms and wisdom and stolen love belongs to the poetic imagination of a much later age, layered onto whatever kernel of real conflict may lie beneath it, the way the campfire and the llama were layered centuries later onto the real silver of a mountain called Potosi. But myths are never told for no reason, and it is worth asking, even this early, what this particular myth is doing, because it is doing real work. It is explaining, in the only language available to a Bronze Age and post-Bronze Age imagination, why a war fought, in all likelihood, over trade routes and tribute and the control of a strategic strait, felt, to the people who remembered it, like something too large for ordinary human motives to explain. A war fought over grain shipments and customs duties on the Hellespont does not sing. A war fought because a goddess of love promised a shepherd the most beautiful woman on earth, and a room full of oath-bound kings had no honourable way to refuse the fight that followed, sings for 3,000 years. We are going to spend a good part of tonight moving back and forth between these two versions of the same catastrophe, the sung version and the likely version, and I promise you, as we always promise on this channel, that neither version told alone gives you the whole truth, and that the truth, as it so often is, lies somewhere in the aching, unresolved space between them. However it truly began, the myth tells us that Paris, grown to manhood and at last recognised and welcomed home to Troy as the prince he had always been, though the prophecy of his infancy was never forgotten and never quite set aside, travelled across the sea as an honoured guest to the court of Menelaus in Sparta, and there, whether through the direct intervention of Aphrodite as the poets insist, or through nothing more supernatural than a young man's charm and a queen's own restless unhappiness, as some later more sceptical tellers allowed themselves to wonder, Paris and Helen fell in love, or were made to fall in love, or simply acted on a desire that needed no goddess to explain it, and while Menelaus was away from his own hall, called off to a funeral in Crete. Paris and Helen left Sparta together by ship for Troy, taking with them, in most versions of the story, a portion of the Spartan royal treasury as well, so that whatever else this elopement was, a love story or an abduction, or something more complicated than either word quite captures, it was also, from the very first hour, a theft, and it would be remembered by the Greeks who told it for the following 3,000 years, under a word that carries both meanings at once and refuses to choose between them, the rape of Helen, in the old sense of the word, a seizing, a taking away, whether she went willingly or was carried off against her will being a question the myth itself, remarkably for so patriarchal an age, never entirely settles, and that later poets and playwrights, and even, in the 5th century before Christ, a professional speechwriter named Gorgias, would spend real intellectual effort arguing over in one of the earlier surviving pieces of what we might now call rhetorical defence law, a formal speech in praise of Helen that argues, point by careful point, that whatever she did, she cannot be blamed for it, because she was compelled, by force, or by persuasion, or by love, or by the will of the gods, and that a woman compelled by any of those 4 things bears no more guilt than a leaf compelled by the wind. We will return to that argument, and to what it says about how later Greeks came to feel about the woman they had spent centuries blaming before this night is over. Menelaus, returning to Sparta to find his wife gone, his guest friend's trust betrayed in the most public and humiliating way a Bronze Age king could imagine, called on the oath. He travelled to his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, richest and most formidable of all the Greek rulers, and together the 2 brothers sent word across the Aegean to every king and prince who had once stood in that crowded Spartan hall and sworn, over the pieces of a sacrificed horse, to defend the marriage of whichever man was chosen. And one by one, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, they came. Some came because honour genuinely demanded it, in a world where a broken oath was not merely a social embarrassment, but an offence against the gods who had witnessed the swearing of it. Some came, the more sceptical tellers of the story have always suspected, because a great war promised great plunder, and a coalition army marching against the wealthiest city on the straits of the Hellespont, a city that controlled, if the stories of its wealth are to be believed, one of the richest trade choke points in the Bronze Age world, was an opportunity no ambitious king could easily pass up, whatever the official reason given for the muster. And one, at least, did not want to come at all, and the story of how he was made to is one of the strangest and most telling episodes in this whole opening act, because it tells us, before a single ship has even sailed, exactly what kind of a man is about to become the cleverest and most essential figure in the entire war. Odysseus, the very man whose clever oath had made this whole muster possible, did not want to fight in it. He had a young wife, Penelope, and a newborn son, Telemachus, and a kingdom of his own on the rocky island of Ithaca that he had no wish to leave, and when the recruiters came for him, he tried, according to the story, to feign madness, yoking an ox and a donkey together to a plough, and driving crooked furrows through a field, sowing salt instead of seed, the very picture of a man too deranged for war. The recruiter sent to fetch him, a shrewd king named Palamedes, was not fooled, and tested the pretense in the cruelest way the story allows. He took the infant Telemachus from his mother's arms and laid him directly in the path of the plough, and Odysseus, forced to choose between maintaining his madness and killing his own son, swerved the plough aside, and in that single instant of a father's unwilled love, his sanity and his fate were both confirmed. He would go to Troy. He would not see his son again, or his wife, or his island kingdom for 20 years, and the long, strange, wave-tossed road home that awaited him at the end of the war would become, in time, a story every bit as famous as the war itself. A story we will save for the long hours near the end of this night, when the war is finally over, and it is time to ask what happened to the men who survived it. And there was one more summons still to come, one more name that had to be added to the muster before the fleet could sail, and it is the summons that gives this whole opening act its darkest and most permanent shadow. A prophecy, or an oracle, or simply the accumulated fear of an age that trusted such things, declared that the greatest warrior among all the Greeks, a young man named Achilles, son of that same sea nymph Thetis, whose wedding had started this whole catastrophe with an uninvited goddess and a golden apple, was fated either to live a long, quiet, unremarkable life and die forgotten in old age, or to go to Troy and win glory that would never die, at the cost of a life that would end young. His mother, who knew both fates and could not bear the second, hid him, disguised as a girl, among the daughters of a king on the island of Skyros, hoping to keep the prophecy from ever finding him. And Odysseus, already proving the value of the cleverness that had bought him his own freedom so briefly, found him there, the story says, by a simple trick. He arrived at the court disguised as a peddler, and laid out among his wares of jewellery and cloth a single sword, and when a trumpet sounded, as if in alarm, the girls of the court fled in fear, and one among them alone reached for the sword instead of running, and so Achilles was discovered. And so, whatever his mother's love had hoped to prevent, the fleet had its greatest warrior, and the war had the name it would carry more than any other single name, down through 3,000 years of telling. The wind that would not blow. The fleet that gathered at last in the Bay of Aulis, on the Greek mainland across the water from the island of Euboea, was, by the poet's own reckoning, a thing almost too large to describe in ordinary language, and Homer, centuries later, would not even try to describe it in ordinary language, but would instead do something no poet before him had attempted on such a scale. He would simply list it, ship by ship, kingdom by kingdom, in a long passage of the Iliad that scholars still call the catalogue of ships, naming contingent after contingent, 29 of them in all, more than 1,000 vessels by the poem's own count, drawn from every corner of the Greek world, Boeotia and Argos and Sparta and Crete and Ithaca, and a dozen lesser kingdoms whose names had already gone half forgotten by the time the poem was finally written down, so that the catalogue itself, dry as a shipping manifest and yet somehow one of the most moving passages in the whole epic, reads like a roll call of the dead taken before a single man had died, a census of a world about to spend itself on a foreign shore. Whether such a fleet ever truly gathered, whether the numbers are anything but the poetic exaggeration of a much smaller raid remembered generations later as something vast we cannot know, and we will have much more to say about that uncertainty before the night is over. But the poets insisted on the number, because the number was the point. This was to be understood from its very first gathering as the largest expedition the Greek world had ever mounted. An entire civilization's fighting strength poured into one bay, waiting for a wind. And the wind would not come. The fleet lay becalmed at Aulis, day after day, the sails hanging slack, the ships going nowhere, and a Bronze Age army fed by nothing but its own supplies, and the patience of kings who had left their own thrones to lead it, does not do well waiting on the weather, and as the days became weeks, the mood in the camp curdled from eagerness into something closer to despair, until at last a seer named Calchas, whose gift for reading the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrifice made him, in a very real sense, as important to the expedition's morale as any warrior in it, delivered a verdict that Agamemnon, commander of the whole assembled host, did not want to hear. The goddess Artemis, Calchas said, was angry in some tellings, because Agamemnon had boasted in the careless way of proud men that he could outshoot her at the hunt, and angry in other tellings for reasons the poets themselves could not agree on, reasons that felt, even to the ancient audiences who first heard them, less like an explanation than an excuse, the kind of divine displeasure that gets invoked whenever a human catastrophe needs a cause too large for any human being to be blamed for it alone. Whatever the reason, the remedy Calchas prescribed was this, and it is worth sitting with the plainness of the sentence before we go any further, because the plainness is exactly what makes it unbearable. The wind would not blow until Agamemnon sacrificed his own eldest daughter, Iphigenia, on the goddess's altar. We are not going to soften this because the story itself, in its oldest and cruelest versions, does not soften it, though later tellers, unable quite to bear the weight of it, would reach for a mercy the earliest audiences were not given. Agamemnon, the story says, sent word home to his wife, Clytemnestra, and to his daughter, with a lie built to bring the girl willingly across the sea to her own death, that Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, wished to marry her, and that she should come at once to Aulis for the wedding. And Iphigenia came, joyful, we are told, dressed for a bride, and found at the end of her journey not a husband but an altar, and a father who had, by every account the ancient world was willing to tell of him, weighed the wind his fleet needed against the life of his own child, and chosen the wind. In the oldest versions, the girl is killed outright, her throat cut on the sand while the assembled army watches in a silence the poets do not describe, because some silences do not need describing. In a gentler, later telling, one that the tragedian Euripides gave the Greek stage some 7 centuries after the events it claims to describe, the goddess Artemis, at the very last instant, pities the girl and snatches her away from the altar, leaving a deer in her place to be sacrificed instead, and carries Iphigenia off to a distant shrine to serve as her priestess, alive, but lost forever to the family that had used her as a coin to buy a wind. Both versions were told and retold for centuries, and it says something true and troubling about how differently different ages have needed this story to end. That neither version ever fully drove the other out of circulation, that Greek audiences went on choosing, generation after generation, whether they could bear a father who killed his daughter or only a father who was willing to. However it ended for the girl herself, it did not end well for the family, because that is the pattern of every debt in this whole long tale, the pattern we are going to trace again and again across the length of this story, the way we have traced it across every long story this channel has ever told. The thing paid in secret, or paid without full reckoning, does not vanish. It waits. And Clytemnestra, the wife and mother who had sent her daughter off in her wedding dress, and received back, by whichever version you choose to believe, either a corpse or a permanent absence and a husband's unrepented lie, did not forget and did not forgive. And for the 10 long years that her husband was gone fighting a war on the other side of the sea, that unforgiven debt sat in the palace at Mycenae like a coal banked under ash, waiting with a patience that would make the whole war look brief by comparison, for the day the fleet finally came home. We will meet Clytemnestra again, much later in this story, on the night that debt was finally called in, and when we do, I want you to remember this bay, and this altar, and this wind, because nothing that happens in that palace 10 years from now happens without this hour at Aulis standing behind it. The wind came, whether bought by a girl's blood or a goddess's late mercy, and the fleet, at last, put to sea, and the whole vast weight of the Greek world's fighting strength turned its prows eastward, toward a strait and a city and a war that none of them, not Agamemnon commanding it, not Achilles sailing toward the very glory and the very early death his mother had tried to hide him from, not Odysseus already dreaming, we may imagine, of the home he had so recently pretended madness to avoid leaving, could have known would take 10 years to finish, and would take 3,000 more to stop being told, 9 years that the poems barely tell. Here is a thing that surprises almost everyone who comes to this story for the first time, expecting a 10-year narrative of a 10-year war. The Iliad, the single most famous poem ever composed about the Trojan War, the poem that gave the whole conflict its lasting shape in the imagination of the Western world, does not tell the story of 10 years at all. It tells the story of a few weeks, perhaps as little as 50 days, in the final year of the siege, and it does not even reach the fall of the city, ending instead with the funeral of a single Trojan prince, the war still very much unresolved, the horse still years in the future. Everything else, the whole vast bulk of the conflict, the 9 years that came before the poem begins and the events that came after it ends, survives only in fragments, in later poems now mostly lost except for summaries and quotations, in plays, in vase paintings, in the scattered retellings of later poets who assumed their audiences already knew the shape of the whole story and felt free to fill in only the corners that interested them. It is worth pausing on that, because it tells you something important about how this entire tale has come down to us. We do not possess one complete Trojan War narrative handed down whole from antiquity. We possess a jigsaw of surviving pieces, the Iliad and the Odyssey intact and towering above everything else, and around them the broken remains of half a dozen other poems, the so-called epic cycle, that once told the rest of the story, the gathering at Aulis, the years of siege, the death of Achilles, the horse, the sack of the city, the long scattering home, poems that we know existed, that ancient scholars quoted and summarized and clearly had read in full, but that time and fire and the simple failure of enough scribes to keep copying them allowed to crumble into fragments and vanish, so that the story you're hearing tonight is a reconstruction, pieced together by this channel the way an archaeologist pieces together a shattered pot from the two great surviving vessels and the broken shards of everything around them. What those 9 missing years seem to have held, so far as the fragments and the later summaries allow us to reconstruct them, was not one long continuous siege in the way a modern reader might imagine it, armies locked in unbroken confrontation for a decade, but something closer to what we now understand real. Bronze Age warfare around a fortified city more likely looked like a long, grinding, seasonal campaign of raids and counter-raids. The Greek army camped on the beach below the walls of Troy, in a vast makeshift city of huts and ships drawn up on the sand, unable to take the city's massive fortifications by direct assault, and so turning instead to the surrounding countryside and the smaller cities allied to Troy, sacking them one by one, carrying off cattle and grain and captive women, weakening Troy's web of alliances and provisioning year by year, string by string, the way a besieging force with no hope of storming a great citadel outright has always had to weaken it, from the outside in, before the outside can finally be brought to bear on the centre. The poems themselves remember this indirectly, in offhand references scattered through the Iliad to cities Achilles had sacked in those 9 years, to captive women, Briseis among them, whom he had won not at Troy itself but in these outlying raids, to treasure and cattle and the ordinary grinding economics of a long siege that had to feed itself somehow across 9 years on a foreign shore, an economics the grand romance of the war's beginning and end tends to make us forget, but that any honest telling of a decade-long campaign has to account for, the way we have had to account, in other stories on this channel, for the unglamorous arithmetic behind every glamorous catastrophe. The Greek camp itself, as the poems describe it, and as the archaeology of the region allows us to imagine it, sprawled along the shore, where the plain of Troy meets the sea, a wide, flat expanse crossed by two rivers the poems name the Scamander and the Simois, rivers that would themselves, in the poem's most fever-dreaming books, rise up as living, furious characters and fight alongside the Trojans against Achilles in a scene so strange and so vivid that it reads, even 3,000 years later, like nothing else in ancient literature, a river god choking on the bodies Achilles has thrown into his waters and rising in a wall of water to drown the man who has defiled him. Along that shore, the ships that had carried the whole army from Greece were drawn up out of the water, hundreds of them, black-hulled and high-prowed, forming a kind of wall of their own, behind which the huts of the army spread, kingdom by kingdom, contingent by contingent. Achilles and his fierce myrmidons camped at one end of the line. Ajax, the great bulwark of the Greek army, second only to Achilles in strength, camped near the other, and Agamemnon's own hut somewhere in the middle. The physical geography of the camp itself a kind of map of the army's politics. Proximity and distance meaning exactly what they always mean among men forced to share close quarters for years at a time. And above it all, on its hill a little back from the plain, close enough to see the ships and far enough to command the whole approach, stood Troy itself, walled, the poems insist, by the gods themselves, Poseidon and Apollo having built its fortifications in an earlier age as a service to a different king, walls so strong that 9 years of the finest fighting men Greece could muster had not been able to breach them by force, a city the poems describe again and again, with an epithet that has outlived every other detail about it. Troy of the well-built walls, windy Troy, holy Ilion, a city named so often and so lovingly in the poem that scholars have long noted a peculiar and moving fact. The Iliad, for all that it is a poem about Greeks fighting Trojans, takes its very title not from the victors but from the city that fell. Ilion, another name for Troy, and the poem is, quite literally, the Song of Ilion, named for the vanquished rather than the victorious. A small detail that already tells you something about the strange even-handedness we are going to spend a great deal of time on before this night is over. It is into this 9th year of grinding, exhausting, unresolved siege, an army homesick and quarrelsome after 9 years away from their own kingdoms and their own families, a city battered but unbroken behind walls that no spear had yet managed to breach, that the Iliad, when it finally opens, drops us in the middle of things, as the later Romans would say of this particular narrative technique in medias res, no scene setting, no recap of the 9 years already spent, but a poem that assumes its audience already knows the whole shape of the war, and chooses, out of 10 years of fighting, to tell us about a quarrel because the poet understood something that every great storyteller since has had to relearn for themselves, that a war of 1,000 ships and 10 years and 100,000 men is too vast a thing for any human heart to hold, and that the only way into a catastrophe of that size is to shrink it, deliberately, ruthlessly, down to the anger of one man in one camp over one woman, in the final weeks of a war he did not start and would not live to see finished. Sing, goddess, the wrath. The poem announces its own subject in its very first word in the original Greek, before it has told you a single fact about the war, before it has named Troy or Helen or Paris at all, Menin, wrath, rage, the terrible anger of Achilles, and everything that follows for the next 15,000 lines is, in the strictest sense, an exploration of what that single word costs. First the Greeks, and then, in a way the poem takes its whole aching length to make clear, Achilles himself. The rage begins, as so many ruinous things in this story begin, with a small injustice compounding an older one. In the 9th year, in the course of one of those raiding expeditions against Troy's allied towns that the poems only mention in passing, the Greeks had captured 2 women as war prizes, part of the ordinary, brutal economy of Bronze Age siege warfare, women taken from sacked cities and distributed among the victorious commanders as spoils, a practice the poems record without any apparent discomfort, because the audiences who first heard these lines did not share the discomfort we bring to them now, and we should say that plainly here, rather than pretend otherwise. This is a poem composed by and for a warrior aristocracy that took the ownership of captured women as an unremarkable fact of war, the way another society might take the ownership of captured cattle. And one of the things this story is going to ask you to sit with, again and again, is the gap between the poem's own values and ours, a gap this channel does not believe in papering over. One of those two women, Chryseis, had been given to Agamemnon himself, and she was, as it happened, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, an old man named Chryses who came to the Greek camp humbly, with a priest's staff and a ransom of treasure, to beg for his daughter's return. Agamemnon refused him, rudely, publicly, in front of the whole assembled army, and sent the old man away with threats, and the old priest, walking back along the shore of a sea he had known his whole life, did the one thing left to a powerless man wronged by the powerful in a world that believed its gods listened. He prayed to Apollo, the god he had served his whole life, and asked for vengeance, and Apollo, in the poem's opening and most terrifying act of divine intervention, answered him. The god came down from Olympus, the poem tells us, like the night, his silver bow across his shoulders, and he sat apart from the Greek ships and began to shoot, and the poem describes, in a passage every reader remembers, the arrows striking first the mules and then the running dogs, and then, at last, the men themselves, a plague descending on the Greek camp arrow by invisible arrow, and for 9 days the funeral pyres burned continuously along the shore, until at last Achilles, watching his own army sicken and die around him for a wrong that was not his, called an assembly and demanded to know why. And the seer Calchas, the same Calchas who had named the price of the wind at Aulis all those years before, stood up and told the army the truth, that Agamemnon's insult to Apollo's priest was killing them, and that the plague would not lift until Chryseis was returned, without ransom, to her father. Agamemnon, forced by the whole assembled army to give up his prize, agreed, but with a fury that curdled instantly into something worse. If he had to give up his woman, he announced in front of every man in the camp, he would take another man's in compensation, and he did not choose subtly. He sent his heralds to Achilles' own hut, and took Briseis, the woman Achilles had won in his own raiding, and had, the poem allows us to understand, come to care for in whatever complicated way a captor comes to care for a captive, in a world that gave her no language of her own to describe it. And it is this act, this public humiliation of the army's greatest warrior by its supreme commander, more than any grand question of war and peace, that lit the fire the whole poem is built around. Achilles' fury is not, in the poem's own accounting, really about Briseis herself, though he mourns her loss and she mourns, we are told, with what the poem calls a grief that was not for Achilles alone, in a line that has always struck careful readers as one of the poem's small, devastating acknowledgments that the women being fought over as trophies had inner lives, the men around them barely troubled to notice. Achilles' fury is about honour, about the fact that he does the hardest fighting and dies soonest, and receives, in the end, exactly the treatment a lesser man might expect, his prize seized by a commander who never risks his own life in the front rank the way Achilles risks his every single day. And so, Achilles does the one thing available to a warrior in that world who feels himself unjustly treated by his own commander. He withdraws. He and his men, the fierce Myrmidons, will fight no more in this war, he announces, and he sits apart from the army by his ships, nursing a rage that the poem will not let him, or us, set down for the rest of its length. And he asks his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, to go to Zeus himself and ask a favour so terrible in its implications that it is worth pausing on, that the god of gods should let the Trojans win, should let the Greek army be driven back to its ships and slaughtered, for as long as it takes Agamemnon to understand exactly what he has thrown away by insulting the one man his army cannot win this war without. It is a request, we should say plainly, that only makes sense inside the particular moral world of this particular poem, a world in which personal honour outweighs, without apparent contradiction, the lives of your own comrades, a world in which a man can love his fellow soldiers, as Achilles unmistakably does, and still ask a god to let them die by the 100 to prove a point about his own wounded pride. And the poem does not flinch from the horror of that request, does not soften Achilles into a simple hero, but lets us watch, across the 15,000 lines that follow, exactly what it costs everyone, Achilles most of all, to get the vengeance he has asked for. Zeus grants it. The tide of the war turns, in the books that follow, decisively against the Greeks. And for the first time in 9 years, the men who have been penned inside the walls of Troy for a decade, watching their allies fall one by one to the raiding parties of a Greek army camped stubbornly on their own beach, begin, at last, to push back, out from behind their walls, onto the open plain, and at the head of that Trojan advance, more than any other single man in this whole enormous story besides Achilles himself, there rides the finest and most tragic figure the Trojan side of this war would ever produce. A man the poem loves, in its own quiet, even-handed way, nearly as much as it loves Achilles, and whose name was Hector, the best of the Trojans. If Achilles is the poem's terrible, glittering engine, the man whose rage drives the whole plot, Hector is its conscience, and it is one of the strange and moving facts about the Iliad, a fact we are going to return to later tonight, when we talk about how remarkably fair this poem is to the side that loses, that the single most sympathetic human being in the entire epic is not a Greek at all, but the eldest son of Troy's King Priam, the city's greatest defender, a man fighting, unlike nearly every Greek on that beach, not for plunder or glory or a stolen woman that was never his to begin with, but simply to save his home, his wife, his infant son, and the ordinary people of a city he did not choose to be born the prince of. The poem gives us, in one of its most quietly devastating scenes, a glimpse of Hector stepping away from the battle for a private moment with his wife, Andromache, and their baby son Astyanax, on the walls of Troy. And Andromache, who has already lost her father and all 7 of her brothers to Achilles in the raids of the earlier years of this same war, begs her husband not to go back out to fight, to stay inside the walls where he might yet be safe, and Hector, who loves her, the poem makes unmistakably clear, as much as any man in this story loves anyone, answers her with words that have been quoted for 3,000 years precisely because they refuse the easy comfort she's asking for, that he cannot hide behind the walls while other men die for the city, that he would be ashamed before the men and women of Troy if he held back from battle like a coward, and that he knows, with a clarity the poem gives to no other character quite so plainly, exactly how this story ends. Sacred Troy will fall, he tells her, and Priam's people with it, and he grieves for that coming ruin less, he says, than he grieves for what will happen to her, led away in slavery to spin wool in a foreign house at another woman's command, and he reaches for his infant son as he says it, and the baby, frightened by the horsehair plume nodding on his father's war helmet, screams and shrinks back into his nurse's arms, and Hector laughs and takes off the terrible bronze helmet and sets it, gleaming, on the ground, and lifts his son, and the poem lets this small, ordinary, universal moment of a father soothing a frightened child sit for a few lines in the middle of an epic about mass slaughter, before Hector puts the helmet back on and walks back out through the gates to a war he already knows, in his own words, that his city cannot win. The fighting that fills the middle books of the Iliad, once Achilles has withdrawn, and the Trojans have found their courage under Hector's leadership, is the closest the poem comes to giving us an ordinary campaign, and it is worth pausing on how strange, by modern standards, that ordinary campaign actually looks, because it is a war fought overwhelmingly not by masses of anonymous infantry, though the poem never forgets those masses are there, dying by the hundred in brief, brutal similes comparing them to falling leaves or driven cattle, but by a small aristocracy of individual champions, men of noble birth riding out from the battle line in horse-drawn chariots to duel other named champions in single combat, while the common soldiers on both sides look on, a style of warfare that archaeologists and historians have argued about for a century, uncertain how much of it reflects the genuine practice of the late Bronze Age, and how much of it is the poetic convention of a much later age projecting its own aristocratic values backward onto a war it could no longer quite picture in any other terms. Whichever it is, it gives the poem its structure, champion against champion, book after book. Diomedes so possessed by battle fury that he wounds two gods in a single afternoon, the goddess Aphrodite herself, fleeing her son Aeneas' side with a bleeding hand, and the war god Ares roaring in pain louder, the poem says, the 9 or 10,000 men, before the gods themselves withdraw, wounded and furious, back to Olympus to nurse grievances that will shape the war's later turns. There is one duel in these middle books that the poem stages with special weight, because it offers, for one tantalizing moment, a way the whole war might simply end without another decade of grinding slaughter. A formal single combat, arranged by both armies with something like relief, between Paris, the man whose theft of Helen started this entire catastrophe, and Menelaus, the husband he wronged, winner take Helen, and the treasure and the war concluded on the spot. The two armies laying down their weapons on the plain between the lines to watch the whole 10 years be settled, at last, by the two men who had the most personal stake in ever starting it. It is a scene worth sitting with, because of what it reveals about how badly, by this point in the story, everyone wants the fighting to simply stop. Trojan soldiers as weary of 9 years of siege as any Greek, and because of how the poem resolves it, Menelaus is winning, has Paris down and is dragging him by the helmet strap toward the Greek lines, when the goddess Aphrodite, unwilling to see her favourite humiliated, simply snaps the strap, wraps Paris in a concealing mist, and spirits him away from the battlefield entirely, back to his own bedroom in Troy, leaving Menelaus standing over an empty helmet in front of two bewildered armies, the duel unfinished, the war, which had come so close to ending in a single afternoon, left to grind on for years more because a goddess would not let her favourite lose fairly. It is one of the poem's clearest statements of a theme we are going to meet again and again tonight, that the gods of this story are not on the whole forces of justice or even particularly of order, but partisans, as petty and as partial as any human faction, intervening not to see the better man win but to see their own favourites spared, and that the human beings caught beneath their quarrels pay, in blood, for divine grudges that have nothing to do with them at all. With Paris humiliatingly rescued from a duel he was losing, the general fighting resumes, and it goes badly, book after book for the Greeks, exactly as Achilles had prayed it would. Hector, fighting with a courage and a skill that the poem never once diminishes to make its Greek heroes look better by comparison, drives the Greek army back across the plain they had held for 9 years, back toward the very ships they had sailed herein, and in one of the poem's most alarming turns actually breaches the wall the Greeks had built, late and almost as an afterthought, to protect their beached fleet, smashing through a gate with a boulder. The poem says 2 ordinary men of a later, lesser age could not lift between them, and setting fire at last to one of the Greek ships themselves, the flames rising over the beach where for 9 years no Trojan force had ever managed to reach. It is the lowest point of the whole war for the Greek cause, the ships themselves, the only way home any of these men have left, beginning to burn, and it is precisely at this moment, with the entire expedition on the very edge of total destruction, that the poem turns, at last, back to the man sitting apart from all of it in his own hut by the shore, still nursing his wounded pride, still refusing to fight, while the army he could save watches its ships catch fire within sight of his own tent. the friend who wore another man's armour. It is not Agamemnon's belated apology that finally moves Achilles, though the poem gives us, in one of its longest and most carefully constructed scenes, an entire embassy of the army's most respected men coming to Achilles' tent to beg him back, offering him treasure beyond counting. 7 tripods and 10 talents of gold and 20 gleaming cauldrons, 7 women skilled in fine handwork, and Briseis herself returned untouched, along with the hand of one of Agamemnon's own daughters in marriage and 7 popular cities to go with her, an offer so lavish that any ordinary quarrel in that world would have been settled by it 100 times over. Achilles refuses. It is one of the poem's great unsettling surprises, because it tells you that what has happened to Achilles by this point in the story is no longer really about Briseis, or even about Agamemnon's insult, but about something the offered treasure cannot touch, a dawning and terrible clarity, expressed in some of the bleakest lines in the whole epic, that no gift, no city, no woman is worth the life a man like Achilles knows he is fated to spend buying glory in this war, and that if life itself is the only thing truly precious, then perhaps the wisest course, whatever it cost his reputation, is simply to go home and live. And Achilles tells the embassy, to their evident horror, that he is thinking of doing exactly that, sailing back to his father's kingdom and growing old in peace, letting the glory of Troy go to someone who wants it more than he now finds that he does. It is not treasure, then, that brings him back, but love and grief, and the particular unbearable circumstance of watching someone he loves pay, in his place, for a quarrel that was never truly theirs. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, a man who had grown up alongside him since childhood, and who shared his tent and in every account the ancient world was willing to give us, shared far more than that, though later ages would argue at length, in ways this channel does not need to referee tonight, over exactly what word best captures the nature of their bond, could not bear to sit any longer watching the Greek army bleed, while his friend nursed a grievance. He begged Achilles, if Achilles himself would not fight, at least to let him, Patroclus, borrow Achilles' own armour and lead the Myrmidons back into the battle, so that the mere sight of that famous armour on the field, the Trojans believing Achilles himself had finally returned to the fight, might be enough to turn the tide and save the burning ships. Achilles agreed, with one condition that the poem lets us feel, in hindsight, as the most fateful sentence in the entire epic. "Drive the Trojans from the ships," he told his friend, "and then come back. Do not press the attack all the way to the walls of Troy itself. Do not, in your borrowed glory, forget that the glory is not truly yours to spend." Patroclus did not listen, and it is worth saying gently that this is one of the oldest and truest patterns this whole story keeps returning to, one we have met on other nights in other guises. The caution given and the caution ignored, in the very flush of the success the caution was meant to prevent. Wearing Achilles' own armour, mistaken by the terrified Trojans for the return of the war's greatest fighter, Patroclus drove them back from the ships in a rout, and the rout became a rampage, and the rampage carried him, against every warning he had been given, all the way to the very walls of Troy, where he might, the poem suggests, have taken the city itself that very afternoon, had the god Apollo not personally intervened, striking the borrowed helmet from his head, stunning him, stripping the armour from his body with divine hands, and leaving him defenceless on the field for a Trojan spear to finish. And it was not even a Trojan common soldier who dealt the final blow, but Hector himself, the best of the Trojans, who did not know, could not have known, that the man dying beneath his spear in another man's borrowed armour was not the terror of the battlefield he believed he had finally killed, but only his beloved friend sent out to save the ships and never told quite firmly enough to stop. What followed, when word reached Achilles that Patroclus was dead, and dead in his own armour, and that Hector was even now stripping that armour from the body to wear as a trophy, is one of the most raw expressions of grief in the whole of ancient literature, a man throwing himself down in the dust and pouring ashes over his own head and hair, a cry so terrible, the poem tells us, that his mother heard it from the depths of the sea and rose up in fear to comfort him, and Achilles telling her, through that grief, that he no longer cares about the quarrel with Agamemnon, no longer cares about honour or treasure, or even his own life, that he knows now with total certainty, because his mother has told him plainly, that his own death will follow closely on Hector's, and that he does not care, that he will kill Hector or die trying, this very day if the gods allow it, because life without Patroclus is no longer a thing worth the trouble of preserving. Thetis, unable to talk her son out of a fate she has spent his whole life trying to prevent, does the only thing left to a mother who cannot save her child from himself. She goes to the god Hephaestus and commissions, in a single divine night, a new suit of armour for her son, a shield described across more than 100 lines of the poem in such loving, encyclopedic detail, a whole world forged into bronze, cities at war and cities at peace, farmers ploughing and dancers dancing, that scholars have spent centuries treating that one shield as a kind of miniature portrait of everything human life contains, set, with devastating irony, into the hands of a man about to use it for nothing but killing. Achilles returns to battle, and the return is less a scene of triumph than a kind of controlled catastrophe. A man so consumed by grief and rage that the poem has him fighting not merely against Trojan soldiers, but in one extraordinary passage against the river god Scamander himself, who rises in fury at having his waters choked with the bodies Achilles has thrown into them, and nearly drowns the greatest warrior of the age before the fire, god Hephaestus, is called in to boil the river back into submission. And it is against this backdrop of a man fighting the very elements of the earth in his grief that the final confrontation, the one the whole poem has been building towards since its opening line, at last arrives. Hector, alone among all the Trojans, stays outside the walls to face him, though his own father Priam and his mother Hecuba beg him from the battlements to come inside, an old man and an old woman pleading with their son not to throw his life away against a man everyone on that field, gods and mortals alike, understands cannot be beaten. And Hector, in one of the poem's most human moments, very nearly does retreat, feels his own courage waver at the sight of Achilles bearing down on him, and turns and runs 3 full circuits around the walls of his own city, the greatest defender of Troy, fleeing in terror before a man everyone, including Hector himself, already knows is about to kill him. It is the god Athena, disguising herself as Hector's own brother and false promising to fight at his side, who finally tricks him into standing his ground, and the deception is revealed only after it is too late to matter, only after Hector, alone, has turned to face Achilles and found the brother he thought stood beside him simply gone. The fight itself, when it finally comes, is almost brief, a spear finding the one gap in the very armour Hector had stripped from Patroclus' body and was wearing. With a terrible irony, the poem does not let pass unremarked at his own death, and as Hector lies dying, he begs Achilles for one mercy, that his body be returned to his family for proper burial rather than left for the dogs and birds, and Achilles, still consumed by a grief that has not begun to cool, refuses him, wishes aloud that his own rage were great enough to let him cut the flesh from Hector's body and eat it raw, and then, in the days that follow, does something that shocks even his own comrades and the watching gods. He ties Hector's corpse by the ankles to the back of his chariot and drags it again and again around the tomb of Patroclus day after day, defiling the body of the finest man Troy had, in a grief so total it has curdled into something the poem itself seems almost afraid of, and it takes the direct intervention of the gods, Apollo shielding the corpse from further harm, and Zeus himself finally sending a message down to Achilles' own tent, to bring this cycle of desecration to an end, and to send in the night an old man walking alone and unguarded into the heart of the enemy camp that had killed his son. That old man was Priam, king of Troy, and the scene of his arrival at Achilles' tent near the very end of the poem is, by the judgment of readers across 3,000 years, one of the most powerful passages ever composed in any language, and it deserves to be told slowly, the way we tell things on this channel, because it is the moral centre the entire poem has been walking toward. Priam, guided in secret through the Greek camp by the god Hermes disguised as a young soldier, comes alone into the tent of the man who has killed more of his sons than any other enemy in this whole war, kneels before him, and does a thing that the poem tells us astonished everyone who witnessed it. He takes Achilles' hand, the hand that killed his son, and kisses it, and asks him to remember his own father, an old man far away who will also someday lose the son he loves, and to have the mercy on Priam that he would want shown to his own father in the same extremity. And Achilles, the poem tells us, wept, for his own father and for Patroclus, and Priam wept for Hector, and the two men, the killer and the father of the killed, sat together in that tent and grieved, each for his own loss, in a shared silence that the poem lets breathe for a long, unhurried passage before Achilles at last agrees to return Hector's body, and even shares a meal with the old king, and grants a truce of 12 days so that Troy can mourn and bury its greatest defender with the honours he deserved. The poem ends, not with the death of Achilles, and not with the fall of Troy, but with the funeral of Hector, the pyre built, the bones gathered into a golden urn, the mourning of a city for the son it could least afford to lose, and it is worth sitting, tonight, with the strangeness and the rightness of that choice, a poem about the wrath of the greatest Greek hero of the age choosing, for its very last image, to let us grieve alongside his enemies. What the great poem leaves untold. Here our two surviving pillars fall silent for a while, because the Odyssey, the other epic that has come down to us whole, will not pick the thread back up until the war is already 10 years finished, and its hero is already most of the way home. And so for the last, strangest chapters of the war itself, the death of Achilles, the fall of Troy, we are thrown back onto the broken fragments of the lost epic cycle. The summaries later scholars made of poems that once existed in full and now survive only as a skeleton of plot points, a handful of quoted lines, and the paintings later Greek artists left on their pottery, working from a fuller tradition than any text we now possess. It is worth telling this next stretch of the story honestly then, as the patchwork it actually is, because that patchwork is itself part of tonight's lesson. Even the ancient Greeks themselves, sitting in their own theatres and reading their own scrolls 500 years after these poems were first composed, did not have one single authoritative account of everything that happened at Troy. They had, much as we do, a shared pool of story-tellings and counter-tellings that sometimes agreed and sometimes did not, a tradition alive enough to keep being reshaped by whichever poet or playwright next took it up. In the fragments that survive, Troy does not simply give up after Hector's death, and it is a mark of how much this whole tradition wanted its city to fall with honour rather than mere exhaustion that the poets kept sending it new champions in these final desperate months. From the east came the Amazons, a legendary nation of warrior women who fought, in Greek imagination, on equal terms with men, and at their head rode a queen named Penthesilea, who arrived at Troy in the days after Hector's funeral, seeking, in some tellings, not merely to defend an ally but to purify herself of an old grief, having killed her own sister by accident in a hunting mishap, and come to Troy in search of a death in battle that might absolve her of it. She fought Achilles himself, and the fragments and the vase paintings that preserve this episode agree on its shape, even where the words are lost. Achilles killed her, and in the very instant of the killing, as her helmet fell away and her face was revealed beneath it, he fell in love with the beauty of the woman he had just slain. A moment of grief and desire tangled together so strangely that later Greek writers could not entirely agree on how to feel about it either, and one persistent strand of the tradition adds a detail that tells you a great deal about the ugliness. This whole story never fully hides beneath its grandeur that a lesser Greek soldier named Thersites, already remembered elsewhere in the tradition as a coarse, disruptive figure who mocked the nobility of his own commanders, jeered at Achilles for weeping over a dead enemy, and that Achilles, in a fury that the poem's own audience seems to have found more understandable than shocking, struck him down on the spot. Another ally came after Penthesilea, from further still, an Ethiopian king named Memnon, son of the dawn goddess Eos, leading his own contingent to Troy's aid, and he too fell to Achilles in single combat, though not before the two goddess mothers of the duelling heroes, Thetis for Achilles and Eos for Memnon, are said to have gone before Zeus himself and begged him to spare their sons, and Zeus, unwilling to favour one grieving mother over the other, is said to have weighed the fates of the two men in a golden scale, and let the scale itself decide who would live and who would die. An image, the weighing of a life on a literal balance, that later Greek tragedy would return to again and again whenever it wanted to remind its audience how little human courage or human love actually counted against the machinery of fate. Eos, the story goes, mourned her son so bitterly and so long that the dew that falls each morning across the earth was said by later poets to be her tears still falling every single dawn, for a son who died on a plain in Asia Minor in a war that was never truly hers. And then, in the same weeks, still before the 10th year of the siege had finally run its course, Achilles himself died, and it is a measure of how thoroughly this tradition understood the logic of its own moral world that the death of its greatest, deadliest, most glorious warrior comes to him not in a fair fight against a worthy opponent, but from an arrow fired, in most versions, by Paris himself, the least martial man in this entire story, the man whose theft of another man's wife started the whole catastrophe, and who had spent most of the war, by the Iliad's own account, more interested in his own bedroom than in the battlefield, guided to its mark, the fragments insist, by the god Apollo's own hand, striking Achilles in the one place his whole body was vulnerable, the heel by which his mother, the story that later ages loved best insists, had once held him as she dipped his infant body into the river Styx to make him invulnerable, forgetting in her haste that the hand holding him could not itself be dipped along with the rest. It is worth noting, and we will return to this later tonight, that this single most famous detail of the entire war, the vulnerable heel that has given the English language the very phrase Achilles' heel, does not appear anywhere in Homer's own poem at all, and was almost certainly added centuries later by poets who wanted a cleaner, crueler irony than the Iliad itself, which already knew Achilles would die young and cared far less about exactly where the fatal wound would land than about what it would mean for a man to spend his whole short life choosing glory over safety ever bothered to supply. The death of Achilles broke something in the Greek camp that even 9 years of grinding siege had not managed to break, and the fragments tell us that the fight over his body, and then, once the body was recovered and burned and its ashes mingled, as he had asked, with those of his beloved Patroclus, the fight over who should inherit his armour, that same magnificent divine armour forged in a single night by Hephaestus, tore the Greek command in two. 2 men claimed the right to it. Ajax, the great bulwark of the army, second only to Achilles himself in strength and courage, a man who had spent the whole war standing, quite literally, as the wall between the Trojans and the ships, and Odysseus, whose cunning had already proven itself again and again, but whose claim to the greatest warrior's armour rested on wit rather than muscle. The Greek chieftains, asked to judge, or in some versions the captured Trojans themselves, asked which of the 2 men they feared more, chose Odysseus and Ajax, who had never in his whole life known how to lose anything gracefully, and who felt the judgment not merely as a defeat, but as a public verdict that his lifetime of unglamorous, unfailing courage counted for less than one man's clever tongue, went mad with the shame of it. In the night, the fragments and the great tragedy Sophocles later built from them tell us, Ajax set out to murder the very commanders who had judged against him, Agamemnon and Menelaus and Odysseus all, only for the goddess Athena, still nursing her old grudge from the judgment of Paris and unwilling to let a Greek hero commit so shameful an act against his own allies, to strike him with a temporary madness that made him mistake a flock of the army's own sheep and cattle for his enemies. And Ajax spent that whole terrible night slaughtering livestock in the belief that he was finally taking his revenge, and woke, in the grey light of morning, surrounded by the blood-soaked carnage of animals rather than men, to a shame so total and so public that no explanation, however true, could undo it. He fell on his own sword before the sun had fully risen, and the poem that Sophocles built from his death centuries later is one of the most searching studies ancient literature ever produced of what happens to a certain kind of rigid, honour-bound man when the world stops honouring him in the one currency he has ever understood, and it belongs, we should say, beside Achilles' own death as a second and quieter tragedy inside the larger one. A reminder that this war did not only kill men with spears and arrows, but broke some of them from the inside in ways no enemy blade ever touched. With Achilles dead and Ajax dead by his own hand, the Greek cause stood, in the 10th year of a war that had already cost it its two greatest warriors, no closer to taking the city than it had stood in the first, and it is at exactly this point of exhaustion, when brute strength and individual glory had both in their turn been tried, and had both, in their turn, failed to bring down Troy's walls, that the tradition turns at last to the one kind of hero this whole war had not yet fully unleashed. Not the strongest man in the Greek camp and not the bravest, but the cleverest. A horse that was never a gift. Before we tell you how the horse was built, we should tell you, honestly, that Homer never describes its building at all. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, years before the horse enters the story, and the Odyssey, when it finally does mention the horse, mentions it only twice, briefly, as a story told within the story, a song sung by a court poet at a feast years after the war is over, and a memory Odysseus himself recalls to a woman who does not yet know who he is, so that the single most famous object in the whole of this legend, more famous in the end than any hero who fought in the war it ended, comes down to a second hand, sung about rather than shown, its full construction preserved only in the same broken fragments of the lost epic cycle, and later filled out in loving, terrible detail by a Roman poet named Virgil, writing 700 years after Homer, for an audience that needed the fall of Troy to be, above everything else, the origin story of their own city, a matter we'll return to before the night is over. The plan, whoever first devised it, was Odysseus's in every version the tradition ever told, and it depended, as all his best plans did, not on strength, but on the oldest and most dangerous weakness any fortified city can have, the desire after 10 years of grinding siege to believe the war is finally, truly over. The Greeks built, under the direction of a craftsman named Epius, a massive wooden horse, hollow within, large enough to hide a company of their finest warriors inside its belly, Odysseus among them, and Menelaus, husband of the woman this whole war was fought over, and Neoptolemus, the son Achilles had left behind on the island of Skyros as a boy, and who had been summoned to the war after his father's death, because a prophecy insisted Troy could not fall without him. They left the horse standing on the empty beach and burned their own camp, and loaded the rest of the army onto the ships and sailed away, not home, but only as far as the nearby island of Tenedos, close enough to see the smoke of Troy from a safe distance, and hid there, waiting. And they left behind, on that empty beach beside the horse, one man, alone, whose entire task was to talk, and whose name was Sinon. When the Trojans, cautious at first, ventured out from their gates to find the siege they had endured for 10 years apparently abandoned, they found this one Greek soldier, bound, or pretending to be bound, weeping and begging for his life. And Sinon told them a story built entirely of lies wrapped around just enough truth to make the lies breathe, that the Greeks, exhausted and despairing of ever taking the city, had at last given up and sailed for home. That the horse was an offering to the goddess Athena, built deliberately too large to fit through the gates of Troy, because an oracle had warned the Greeks that if the Trojans ever took the horse inside their own walls, the city would become forever invincible, and that he himself, Sinon, had been chosen by his own comrades as a human sacrifice to speed their voyage home, and had only barely escaped the altar to hide, terrified, in the marshes until the fleet was gone. It is worth pausing on the pure, ordinary human genius of this lie, because it is a masterpiece not of magic or divine trickery, but of understanding exactly what the people you are lying to most want to hear. And Sinon gave the Trojans, after 10 years of grief and siege and the deaths of Hector and so many other sons, the two things they wanted more than anything else in the world: proof that their enemies had finally admitted defeat, and a reason to believe that taking one final glorious prize, a monument to their own God-given invincibility, cost them nothing at all. Not everyone believed him. The tradition preserves, and Virgil later immortalised in some of the most famous lines of Latin poetry ever written, the warnings of two people who saw through the trick and were not listened to, in a pattern this channel has learned to watch for in every disaster it has ever told, the warning given and the warning ignored. A priest of Troy named Laocoon hurled a spear into the horse's flank, and the tradition says the hollow wood rang out with the sound of armour clashing inside it, a sound that should have ended the deception on the spot, and Laocoon warned his fellow citizens in words that have outlived nearly everything else about him, that he feared the Greeks even when they came bearing gifts, and for his suspicion, in the version the tradition loved best, 2 great serpents rose from the sea and crushed him and his 2 young sons to death in front of the whole horrified city. A punishment the Trojans read, in their desperate need to believe the war was over, not as a warning but as proof that Laocoon had somehow offended the gods by attacking the sacred offering, and so they dragged the horse inside their own walls all the faster to make amends. And there was Cassandra, daughter of Priam, a princess cursed by the god Apollo, who had once desired her and given her the gift of true prophecy, and who, when she refused him, could not take the gift back, and so twisted it instead, leaving her able to see the future with perfect clarity, and utterly unable to make anyone believe a word of it, a curse that the whole tradition treats as one of the cruelest single fates handed to any figure in this story, because it means Cassandra spends this entire final night of Troy's existence screaming the plain, simple truth that the horse is death, that the Greeks are hidden inside it, that the city is about to burn, to a population that has quite literally been supernaturally guaranteed never to listen to her, and there could hardly be a sharper image in this whole enormous story of what it feels like to watch a catastrophe coming and be powerless to stop it. Not because no one warned the world, but because the world had already decided long before the warning came not to hear it. So the Trojans widened their own gate, tearing down a section of the very walls the gods themselves were said to have built, to bring the horse inside, and that night the whole city gave itself over to the kind of celebration that 10 years of grief had more than earned. Wine poured in every temple and every house, garlands hung in doorways, the terrible patient watchfulness that a decade of siege requires finally at long last allowed to relax, and in the small hours of the morning, when the wine had done its work and the city slept, the deep, unguarded sleep of a people who believed, with every fibre of their exhausted hearts, that they had survived, Sinon crept to the horse and opened the hidden hatch in its flank, and the Greek warriors climbed down, silent, into a city with no watch set on its walls, and no gate closed against them, and opened Troy's own gates from the inside to the army that had sailed back, under cover of that same darkness, from its hiding place behind the island of Tenedos. Troy, which had held for 10 years against every spear and every siege engine the Greek world could bring against it, fell in a single night, not to force, but to its own desperate, understandable, fatal willingness to believe that the worst was finally over. the night the city burned. We have spent a great deal of tonight inside the grand, glittering machinery of gods and champions, and before we let this story move on to what came after, it is worth doing what we try always to do on this channel before we let a catastrophe recede into legend, which is to slow down and go down into the streets themselves, into the body and the senses, because the ledgers of myth, the tallies of which hero killed which, flatten a night like this one into abstraction, and the truth of it was never an abstraction to the people who lived and mostly did not survive inside it. It began, the tradition tells us, with fire, torches thrown onto rooftops that had, only hours before, been garlanded for a celebration. The same wine that had let the whole city sleep so soundly, now turning the alleys treacherous with drunken, half-armed men stumbling awake into a slaughter they had no time to organise a defence against. And it is worth remembering, here, something this channel has said before about disasters that arrive at night. That darkness does not only hide the attacker, it strips the defender of every advantage organisation might otherwise give him, so that what should have been, on paper, a battle between a hidden company of infiltrators and an entire armed city became, in practice, a massacre of confused, half-dressed men cut down in doorways and courtyards before they could find their own weapons, let alone their own captains. Priam, king of Troy, an old man who had ruled his city for the better part of 50 years, and who had, by every account the tradition gives us, already lost more sons to this single war than any father should be asked to bear. Hector, chief among them, put on his old armour one last time, the tradition says, though his wife Hecuba begged him not to, told him plainly that his strength was long gone, and that an old man's spear would only get him killed without saving anyone, and led him instead to the altar of Zeus in their own palace courtyard, to seek what shelter a god's own altar might still offer a king whose city was burning around him. It did not offer him much. In the fullest telling of his death, the one Virgil gives us centuries later, drawing on a Greek tradition already old in his own time, it was Neoptolemus, the young son Achilles had never lived to raise, who found the old king clinging to that altar, and who killed him there, at the foot of his own household gods, in front of the wife who had begged him not to go out and meet exactly this end. An old man's whole life and whole kingdom ended in a single stroke, at the one place in the city that should, by every rule that mattered to that world, have been sanctuary. His grandson did not survive the night either, and the story of that child's death is, of every single loss this whole long war produced, the one that later Greek tragedy returned to most often, and returns to still, because it strips away every excuse of glory or honour or fair combat that the rest of the war at least pretended to offer, and leaves only the plain, unbearable fact of what conquest does to the people who never fought it. Astyanax, the infant son of Hector and Andromache, the same baby who had cried at the sight of his father's war helmet in that quiet scene on the walls years before, was, in every surviving version of this night, thrown from the walls of Troy on the argument, spoken plainly by the Greek commanders who ordered it, and preserved just as plainly in the plays later Athenians wrote about it, that a son of Hector, left alive, might grow to manhood and avenge his father, and rebuild the city they had all spent 10 years and so many lives destroying, that a conquered enemy's children are never merely innocent bystanders to the men who fear what those children might become. Andromache, who had already lost her father, all 7 of her brothers, and her husband to this single war, watched her son killed in this way, and was led away afterward. The tradition tells us without flinching, as a slave and a concubine to Neoptolemus, the very young man responsible for both of her worst losses in a single night, forced to bear him children in a foreign land while the memory of Hector, and of the baby who had laughed in his father's arms on the walls of a city that no longer existed, went with her into a captivity that would last the rest of her life. Cassandra, still cursed to speak true prophecies that no one would ever believe, fled to the temple of Athena and clung to the statue of the goddess herself, the last and holier sanctuary the city had left, and was torn from it anyway by a Greek soldier named Ajax, not the great Ajax who had died by his own hand after the contest for Achilles' armour, but a lesser man of the same name whom later tradition distinguishes by calling him Ajax the Lesser, and the assault committed against her in that violated temple, in full view of the goddess's own image, was remembered by the ancient world as such a profound sacrilege that it became, in the tellings that followed, the single act most directly blamed for the terrible, stormy, shipwrecking voyage home that awaited the entire Greek fleet, a debt the gods would spend years collecting from men who had thought, when they sailed away from Troy's burning ruins, that the reckoning was already finished. Cassandra herself survived the sack only to be handed as a war prize to Agamemnon, and carried home to Mycenae to a fate we will speak of soon, one more woman among the uncounted, many whose whole future was decided in the space of a single night, by men who had never asked her a single question about what she might have wanted, and Hecuba, the old queen who had ruled at Priam's side for 50 years, who had borne 19 children by some accounts, and watched this single war take nearly all of them from her, who had begged her husband not to arm himself one last time, and had then watched him killed anyway at his own altar, was taken alive, an old woman enslaved in the ruins of the only home she had ever known, and it is worth pausing here on a question this channel has learned to ask of every catastrophe it has ever told. How many in the end died that night, and how many were carried off? And the honest answer, as it so often is when we ask that question of the poor and the powerless, rather than the named and famous, is that nobody counted, and so nobody knows. The tradition gives us names, Priam and Astyanax and a handful of others, whose deaths mattered enough to particular poets to be preserved in particular lines. But Troy, by every account, was a great and popular city, one of the wealthiest on the whole coast of Asia Minor, and a great and popular city put to the sword and the torch in a single night does not lose a dozen named men. It loses thousands upon thousands of people whose names no poet ever troubled to learn. Common soldiers cut down half-armed in their own doorways, old men and old women and children who are neither warriors nor royalty, and who therefore appear in no surviving account at all except as a kind of ambient, unindividuated horror, background figures in scenes whose foreground is reserved for kings, and it is one of the oldest and most uncomfortable truths this channel keeps returning to in story after story across very different centuries, that the historical record, ancient or modern, mythic or documentary, has always found it far easier to count and to grieve the losses of the famous few than the losses of the anonymous many, and that an honest telling of any catastrophe has to hold both of those facts in mind at once. The grief that the poems do give us for Priam and Astyanax and Andromache is real and earned and worth every line of poetry it has ever received, and it is also, unavoidably, only the smallest visible fraction of a suffering that the tradition itself never fully counted, and that we, 3,000 years later, have no honest way to recover. The women who survived that night, the ones the tradition does trouble to name beyond Andromache and Cassandra and Hecuba, were divided among the victorious Greek commanders as prizes, exactly as Chryseis and Briseis had been divided 9 years before, in the very quarrel that had opened the whole poem we spent the earlier part of tonight inside, and it is worth noting plainly that the entire war both began and ended with the same transaction, women's bodies and women's futures allotted among men as spoils of honour, a fact the Iliad itself had already quietly indicted in its opening books, and that the sack of Troy simply enacted on a vastly larger scale. A later Athenian playwright, Euripides, writing more than 700 years after the events he describes, for an audience that had, in his own lifetime, watched its own city commit an eerily similar atrocity against a smaller neighbouring island called Melos, put those enslaved Trojan women on the stage themselves, gave voice, for one of the only times in the whole ancient tradition, to Hecuba and Andromache and Cassandra, not as prizes to be distributed, but as grieving human beings forced to reckon, in real time, with the total destruction of everything they had ever loved, and it remains to this day one of the starkest anti-war works any civilization has ever produced, precisely because it refuses the comfort every other telling of this story allows itself, the comfort of ending on the fall of the walls or the burning of the city, and insists instead on staying a little longer with the women left standing in the ashes, waiting to be loaded onto the ships of the men who had just killed everyone they loved. The city itself burned for what the tradition suggests was days. The great walls that no army had managed to breach by force finally torn down stone by stone once there was no longer anyone left inside them to defend. The treasures of a kingdom that had controlled one of the richest trade choke points in the Bronze Age world loaded onto Greek ships alongside the women, and somewhere in that smoke and ruin, though no single surviving version agrees on exactly how, one Trojan prince is said to have slipped away with his life, his aged father carried on his own back, his young son led by the hand, his wife lost in the confusion of the flight and never recovered. A man whose name was Aeneas, and whose escape from this burning city, alone among everything else that happened on that terrible night, would go on, in the hands of a Roman poet writing 7 centuries later, to become the founding myth of an empire that would one day rule the very Mediterranean world this war had been fought beside. A thread of the story we are going to follow, along with several others, once we have first accounted for what became of the men who won, the returns. There is a particular cruelty in this story, as in so many others we have told on this channel, in discovering that winning a war and surviving it are not after all the same accomplishment, and that a man could walk out of the ashes of Troy alive, laden with treasure and glory and captive women, and still not be safe. Not yet, not for years, because the sea and the gods between them had a whole second reckoning waiting, one the poets called, collectively, the nostoi, the returns, or the homecomings, a word that in Greek carries inside it both the joy of arriving home and, buried just beneath that joy, the ache of everything the word implies might not, after all this time and all this cost, still be waiting there unchanged. Of the many kings and princes who had sailed for Troy a decade before, the tradition tells us that only a small handful ever made it back to their own halls in anything like the condition they had left them, and it opens this whole second act of catastrophe with an act of sacrilege so raw that everything which follows can be read as its aftershock. The assault on Cassandra, torn from the very statue of Athena in her own violated temple, which so offended the goddess who had, for the whole of the war, been the Greeks' own fiercest patron, that Athena is said to have gone in a fury to Poseidon, god of the sea, and asked him to make the voyage home a torment for the very men whose cause she had championed for 10 years. And Poseidon, who needed little persuading, given his own long list of grievances against the Greeks and Trojans both, obliged her. The fleet that had sailed from Aulis a decade before as one vast unified host did not sail home together at all, in most tellings, but scattered, some captains eager to leave at once and beat the storm season, others wanting to linger and make proper sacrifice for the sack of a sacred city before daring the sea, a disagreement that split the returning Greeks, even in their moment of victory, into quarrelling factions, one more small proof that this war, whatever else it accomplished, had never actually made its winners into a single people, only ever a coalition, bound by an oath sworn at a wedding feast that had, by this point, been fully paid and was under no further obligation to hold anyone together at all. Storms scattered the ships that sailed too soon, wrecking some on the very rocks that had claimed other fleets before and would claim others after, and one particularly vivid strand of the tradition tells us that the smaller Ajax, the very man who had torn Cassandra from Athena's altar, was among those shipwrecked, and that he survived the wreck itself only to boast, in his relief, that he had escaped the sea against the will of the gods, a boast so recklessly proud that Poseidon himself, hearing it, struck the very rock the man was clinging to with his trident and split it in two, drowning him at last for the sacrilege he had never truly answered for. Of all the returns, the one the tradition dwells on longest and most bitterly is the return of Agamemnon, commander of the whole Greek host, king of Mycenae, rich in gold, and it is here, at last, that we return to a debt we asked you, much earlier tonight, to remember. The altar at Aulis, the daughter sacrificed or spirited away for a wind, the mother who had sent her only to receive back either a corpse or a permanent unexplained absence, and 10 years of silence in which to let that grief harden into something colder and far more patient than grief alone. Clytemnestra had not spent those 10 years merely waiting. In the version of the story that became, in time, the most famous, she had taken a lover, a cousin of Agamemnon's named Aegisthus, himself the survivor of an older and even darker family curse running through this same royal house, a lineage in which grandfathers had murdered grandsons and served them to their own fathers at unknowing feasts, a horror we do not need to unpack in full detail tonight, except to say that the house of Atreus, the family Agamemnon belonged to, was already, long before Troy, one of the most cursed and blood-soaked lineages in the whole of Greek myth, so that Clytemnestra's vengeance, when it came, arrived not as an isolated act of one wronged wife, but as the next turn of a wheel that had been grinding through that family for generations. Agamemnon came home in triumph, his ships loaded with the plunder of Troy, and beside him, taken as his own prize from the sack of the city, rode Cassandra, the cursed princess whose gift of true prophecy no one had ever believed. And it is one of the tradition's bleakest ironies that Cassandra, arriving at the very gates of the palace where her own murder and Agamemnon's both were about to be carried out, saw the whole thing coming with total useless clarity, and said so out loud to a chorus of elderly Mycenaean citizens who listened to her raving about blood and axes and the smell of slaughter already in the house, and, exactly as her curse required, did not believe a single word of it. Clytemnestra welcomed her husband home with every appearance of a wife's joy, laid a path of rich purple cloth for him to walk on into his own hall, a gesture of honour so extravagant that Agamemnon himself, in the great tragedy the Athenian playwright Aeschylus built from this scene some 700 years later, hesitates before it, uneasy, sensing without quite naming it that such honours belong properly only to the gods, and that walking on them himself invites a kind of arrogance the gods do not forgive. And then, having persuaded him past his own unease, led him inside to a bath, and there, tangled in a net or a robe thrown over him while he could not defend himself, she struck him down herself, with an axe, some virgins say twice, others 3 times, and killed Cassandra alongside him, so that the woman whose gift had been to see every disaster coming and to be believed by no one died, in the end, exactly as she had always known she would, and had always been powerless to prevent. We are not going to leave this story here, tangled in one more murder in one more royal hall, because the house of Atreus was not finished paying its debts, and the pattern this whole night has traced again and again, the wrong that does not vanish but only waits, reached one more turn before it finally broke. Orestes, the son Agamemnon and Clytemnestra had left behind as a boy when the fleet sailed for Troy, grew to manhood in exile, torn, in every version the tragedians gave the story, between 2 obligations that Greek custom held equally sacred, and that this single crime had made impossible to satisfy both at once. The duty of a son to avenge his murdered father, and the horror, deeper than almost any other in the ancient Greek moral imagination, of a son who kills his own mother. He did it anyway, urged on, in most tellings, by his sister Electra, who had stayed in the palace all those years nursing the same grief and the same fury her mother had once nursed for a different daughter, and the killing of Clytemnestra by her own son did not end the cycle so much as summon, out of the deep old world of pre-Olympian justice, the Furies themselves, ancient goddesses of blood vengeance who exist in the tradition to punish exactly this crime. the shedding of a mother's blood by her own child, and who pursued Orestes across the Greek world, driving him half mad with a guilt that no ordinary purification could wash away, until at last, in Aeschylus's telling, the goddess Athena herself intervened, calling the very first trial by jury the Greek imagination had ever conceived, weighing vengeance against justice in an actual court in the city that bore her own name, and ruling at the end of it that the cycle would stop here, that the ancient law of blood for blood would give way, from this case forward, to the newer law of reasoned judgment. It is one of the strangest and most hopeful turns in this entire tradition, a myth about a war fought over stolen honour-ending, 3 generations and one whole royal house later, not in one more killing, but in the invention, however idealised, of a court of law, and it is worth sitting with tonight as proof that even a story this soaked in blood could imagine, eventually, a way out of the cycle it had spent so long describing. Menelaus, whose stolen wife had started this whole catastrophe, fared better than his brother, though not quickly. The Odyssey tells us, in a scene set years after the war, that he and Helen were driven by storms far off their homeward course, to Egypt and beyond, gathering fresh treasure as they wandered, before finally making their way back to Sparta, where they lived. By every account the tradition gives us, in a palace of real and settled wealth, receiving guests, including Odysseus's own son Telemachus, who comes seeking news of his long-missing father, with a warmth and an ease that later readers have always found faintly startling. A husband and the wife who left him for another man's bed sitting together, years later telling stories of the war her theft had caused, as though it were now simply one more piece of shared history between them. Helen herself, recalling in one famous passage a night during the siege when she nearly gave the Greek game away and then thought better of it, and Menelaus recalling the same night with an affection that suggests, whatever the poets never quite say outright, that some kind of peace, however strange and however unequally earned, had been made between them in the years since Troy burned. And then there is Odysseus, whose own return took not months but a full 10 years beyond the 10 already spent at Troy. 20 years in all, since he had swerved his own plough rather than run it over his infant son, and whose journey home became, in the hands of the same tradition that gave us the Iliad, a poem every bit as vast and as beloved, the Odyssey, a story of shipwrecks and monsters and enchantresses and a long, patient, disguised return to a home that did not know, after 2 decades, whether its king was alive or dead, and to a wife, Penelope, who had spent those same 20 years fending off a hall full of suitors eager to claim her hand and her husband's kingdom both. By the simple, endlessly clever expedient of weaving a burial shroud by day and secretly unravelling it again each night, promising to choose among her suitors only once the weaving was finished, a piece of patient, quiet cunning that the tradition itself is careful to note makes her, in her own way, every bit her husband's equal, the cleverest woman in a story that gave its cleverest man a whole second epic to himself. It is a journey too vast to tell in full tonight, though we may return to it, in its own right, on some other night in this same quiet room, and we mention it now only to say this, that of every hero who sailed for Troy, the one who is remembered best for surviving rather than for dying gloriously is the one man in the whole story who had never wanted to go in the first place, who had tried to feign madness to stay home with his wife and his newborn son, and who spent 20 years in the end fighting his way back to exactly the quiet, unglamorous life he had tried, at the very beginning of this story, to protect. The refugee who founded an empire. There is one more return to tell, stranger than all the others, because it is not, in the end, a return at all, but a flight into permanent exile that later ages would transform into the grandest origin story the ancient world ever gave to a single city. We left Aeneas, a Trojan prince and a cousin of Hector's, escaping the burning ruins of Troy with his aged father Anchises on his shoulders, and his young son Ascanius by the hand, his wife lost somewhere behind him in the smoke and confusion of that final night, and it fell, 700 years after Homer, to a Roman poet named Virgil, writing at the express and personal encouragement of the Emperor Augustus himself, to take that one surviving scrap of the old tradition a single fleeing family in a burning city, and build from it an entire second epic, the Aeneid, which tells us that Aeneas, guided by prophecy and by the gods, wandered the Mediterranean for years, much as Odysseus had, losing his own father to old age along the way, falling in love with and then abandoning a North African queen named Dido, whose grief at his departure the poem renders with a tenderness that makes her, to many readers across the centuries, the single most sympathetic figure in the entire epic, before finally arriving in Italy, where his descendants, the poem insists, would one day found the city of Rome itself, so that the Roman Empire, at the very height of its own power, chose to trace its founding not to any purely Roman hero, but to a refugee of the Trojan War, a defeated man from a burned city on the far side of the Aegean, carrying his father and his household gods to a new home he had never asked to go looking for. It is worth pausing on why a civilization as proud and as self-assured as Augustan Rome would choose, of all the stories available to it, a story of defeat as its own founding myth. And the answer tells you something true about the peculiar power this whole tradition had already accumulated by the time Virgil sat down to write, 7 centuries after Homer and a full millennium, or very nearly, after the Bronze Age world the war was supposedly fought in had already crumbled into dust. To claim descent from Troy was to claim descent from the oldest, grandest, most storied conflict the Mediterranean world had any memory of, older than Rome itself by a margin so vast it made the young city's own history look, by comparison, provincial, and it let Rome claim, in one poetic stroke, both an ancient and honourable pedigree and a kind of moral vindication, the idea that Troy's fall had not been a true ending after all, that out of the ashes of that first great catastrophe, a single surviving line had carried forward, patiently, generation after generation, to become, in the fullness of time, the mistress of the very Mediterranean world that had once conspired to burn its first home to the ground. There is a symmetry in it that this channel finds almost too neat to be entirely comfortable with. The losers of the Trojan War becoming, 1,000 years later, in poetry, if not in strict fact, the ancestors of the greatest empire the ancient world would ever produce, and we will have more to say before the night is over about how thoroughly later ages kept reaching back into this one war, over and over across 3,000 years, to find in it whatever founding story, whatever justification, whatever grand and ancient pedigree their own moment happened to need, the mound above the strait. And now, having told the story the way the ancient world told it, gods and golden apples and a horse and a war fought over the most beautiful woman alive, it is time to do what this channel always eventually does, and turn the story over, the way one turns over a coin, to look at the other face of it, the face the poets were never trying to show us, because for nearly 3,000 years after Homer, the Trojan War existed only as poetry, only as legend, a magnificent story that educated people across the whole Greco-Roman world grew up believing had happened, more or less as told, and that a slowly growing number of sceptical minds, by the time of the European Enlightenment, had come to dismiss entirely, filing Troy away alongside the labours of Hercules and the voyage of the Argonauts as a beautiful invention with no more historical substance than a fairy tale, a judgment that held more or less unchallenged among serious scholars, until a wealthy, restless, and by most honest accounts deeply unscrupulous German businessman decided in the middle of the 19th century that he intended to find the real city with his own 2 hands, whatever the professor said. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and it is worth telling his story honestly with all its considerable warts, because the history of how we came to know anything at all about the real Bronze Age world behind this legend runs directly and unavoidably through a man whose methods, judged by the standards of his own age, let alone ours, range from merely careless to something close to outright fraudulent, and whose motives were never purely or even primarily scholarly. Schliemann had made a considerable fortune in trade, some of it, later research has strongly suggested, resting on business dealings a great deal less honourable, than the romantic autobiography he later wrote about himself liked to claim, and having made that fortune, he turned to the one obsession that had gripped him. He always insisted since childhood, a boyhood conviction, almost certainly embellished long after the fact in his own later retelling, that the Iliad was not mere poetry, but literal history, and that the city of Troy was real and findable, and that he, Heinrich Schliemann, amateur, self-taught, contemptuous of the university scholars who had spent their whole careers insisting the story was myth, would be the one to find it. He was not, in fact, the first to guess where to dig. A British scholar and diplomat named Frank Calvert had already identified a large, unpromising-looking mound near the Dardanelles called Hisarlik as the most likely site of ancient Troy. Based on careful reading of the ancient geography the poems themselves described, and had already begun small excavations of his own on a portion of the land he owned there, lacking only the fortune to dig on the scale the site demanded, and it is one of the smaller, quieter injustices woven through this whole story of rediscovery that Calvert's patient, careful scholarship has been so thoroughly overshadowed in the popular imagination ever since by the louder, richer, far more self-promoting man he brought in as a partner. Schliemann began digging at Hisarlik in the 1870s, and he dug by nearly every modern archaeological standard terribly, driving a massive trench straight down through the mound in his impatience to reach what he assumed must be the oldest, and therefore the most storied layers at the very bottom. A method that, we now know, with the benefit of a century and a half of more careful excavation, tore straight through and permanently destroyed enormous quantities of exactly the archaeological evidence, the very layers from the period the war would actually have to have occurred in, that he claimed to be searching for, a fact that should sit uncomfortably with anyone tempted to romanticize him as a simple visionary, rather than insignificant part a wrecking ball with a checkbook. And yet he found something, or said he did, in a way that requires exactly the same careful skepticism we bring to every other part of this story. In May of 1873, digging in the deepest layers of the mound, layers we now know date to a period roughly 1,000 years too early to have anything to do with the war Homer describes, Schliemann announced the discovery of a hoard of gold and silver artifacts, diadems and cups and thousands of gold beads and rings that he immediately, and with characteristic flair for publicity, christened Priam's treasure, naming it directly for the king of Troy himself, and claimed, in a story that later research has cast very serious doubt on, that he had watched for the moment his workmen took their midday break and then dug the treasure out himself with his own hands, using only a knife, so that no one else could claim a share of the credit or the find, and that his wife Sophia, standing beside him, had then walked away wearing some of the ancient jewellery draped over her own body, for a photograph that remains, to this day, one of the most famous and most misleading images in the whole history of archaeology. A picture that told the watching world, far more effectively than any scholarly paper could have, that the treasure of Homer's Troy had been found at last, worn by a living woman as proof. It very likely had not been found at all, not in the way Schliemann claimed. Scholars examining his notebooks and his shifting accounts in the years and decades since have found good reason to believe that the treasure may not have come from a single dramatic hoard at all, that Schliemann assembled the story, and quite possibly assembled the collection itself, out of finds recovered at different times from different places within the mound, stitched together into a single dramatic narrative because a single dramatic narrative sold books and secured funding far better than an honest account of scattered, ambiguous fragments ever could, and it is worth sitting with that tonight, because it is the same pattern this channel has traced in other stories on other nights. The wish to touch the myth directly is so powerful that it can bend even the evidence meant to prove the myth true, and Schliemann, whatever else he was, understood before almost anyone else in his profession that a story the public could believe in mattered, to his own fame and fortune at least, rather more than a story that was simply, carefully, unglamorously accurate. The the treasure itself, smuggled out of Ottoman Turkey in defiance of the antiquities laws Schliemann had explicitly agreed to when granted his permit to dig, ended up in Berlin, was seized by Soviet troops as war booty at the end of the Second World War, vanished from public knowledge entirely for nearly half a century, and resurfaced to considerable international controversy that continues even now in a museum in Moscow in the 1990s, so that Priam's gold, whoever it truly belonged to and whenever it was truly buried, has itself become a small microcosm of this whole story's larger themes, treasure and war, and the uneasy question of who, in the end, actually has the right to keep what force and cleverness together have carried away. But it is a mistake, and we should say so clearly to let Schliemann's very real flaws erase the genuine and lasting importance of what his digging, however clumsy, actually revealed. Because underneath his wrecked and hastily dug trenches, later archaeologists working with far greater patience and far greater care found something Schliemann's own impatience had very nearly destroyed. Not one city at Hisarlik, but 9, layered one on top of the ruins of another across roughly 3,500 years of continuous and repeated habitation, each layer given by scholars a number. Troy the First at the very bottom, the oldest and smallest settlement, up through Troy the Ninth at the very top. A Greco-Roman town that stood on the same hill many centuries after the war the poems describe would have to have been fought. A German architect named Wilhelm Dörpfeld, working at the site in the 1890s with a rigour Schliemann himself had never quite managed, identified the layer called Troy VI as by far the most impressive candidate for Homer's city, a settlement with genuinely massive sloping fortification walls, exactly the kind of well-built walls the poems praise so often, walls that showed clear evidence of having been damaged and rebuilt, and Dörpfeld's Troy VI held the field as the leading candidate for a full generation until an American archaeologist named Carl Bliegen, digging at the site through the 1930s with even more careful, more modern stratigraphic methods, made a discovery that shifted the whole picture again. Troy VI, Bliegen concluded, had almost certainly been destroyed not by human war at all, but by an earthquake, a conclusion the twisted, toppled masonry at the site seemed strongly to support, and Bliegen instead identified a sublayer just above it, a hastily rebuilt and more modest settlement his team called Troy VII-A, as the far more likely candidate for a city destroyed by human violence, because Troy VII-A showed exactly the signs a besieged and sacked city ought to show, evidence of overcrowding, as though a population had squeezed itself into a smaller defensible space in anticipation of trouble. Storage jars sunk into the floors of houses in unusual numbers, as though a city expecting a long siege had been hoarding grain against exactly that expectation. Skeletal remains left unburied amid the wreckage, a detail that in careful, sober, archaeological language carries an unmistakable echo of catastrophe, and most tellingly of all, a clear and extensive layer of destruction by fire. Bliegen dated that destruction by careful analysis of the pottery styles found in and around it to somewhere around the year 1180 before Christ, give or take a few decades, a date that sits, remarkably, almost exactly where the later Greek tradition itself, working entirely independently through its own chronologies and king lists centuries before any archaeologist ever put a spade in the ground, had always placed the fall of Troy. It is one of the genuinely startling correspondences in this whole tangled story, a case where myth and material evidence, arrived at by completely different methods across a gap of nearly 3,000 years, land close enough to the same moment that even hardened skeptics have to sit up and take notice. And more recent excavation, carried out from the 1980s onward under a German archaeologist named Manfred Kaufmann, using techniques Schliemann could not have dreamed of. Geophysical surveying that let his team map buried structures without digging a single trench has revealed that the citadel Schliemann and Dörpfeld and Bliegen all worked on, the walled hilltop that had seemed, for a century, disappointingly small to be the setting for a war that supposedly consumed 1,000 ships in 10 years, was in fact only the fortified royal centre of a much larger settlement, a lower town spreading out across the plain around the base of the hill, protected by its own outer defensive ditch. A city, in other words, considerably larger and more significant than a century of earlier excavation had ever managed to prove, exactly the kind of prosperous, strategically vital settlement that a war fought over control of the strait to its north would actually have made sense fighting over. And it is that outer wall, that ditch, that lower town, that finally lets us bring in the other great body of evidence this whole story had been waiting 3,000 years for anyone to properly read. The archive of the Hittite Empire, the great Bronze Age power whose capital lay far to the east in central Anatolia, and whose kings, we now know from the tens of thousands of clay tablets recovered from that capital's ruins beginning in the early 20th century, kept meticulous, business-like records of their dealings with a whole web of vassal states and rival powers stretching across the length and breadth of Asia Minor, records that mention, again and again, across roughly 2 centuries of correspondence, a western kingdom the Hittites called Wilusa, a name that linguists, comparing the sound shifts across the different branches of the ancient languages, involved with the same painstaking care that let other scholars finally crack Linear B, have concluded was almost certainly pronounced in an earlier form, something extremely close to Wilios, which is in turn an older and alternate Greek name for the very city the poems more commonly call Ilion, so that Wilusa and Ilion, the Hittite vassal kingdom and the city Homer sang of, appear on the current best linguistic evidence to be one and the same place, called by 2 different peoples in 2 different tongues, by names that had simply drifted over the centuries into 2 different sounds for what had once been a single word. The tablets tell us real, concrete, unglamorous things about this kingdom that no line of Homer ever bothered to preserve, because the Hittite scribes who wrote them were not composing poetry, they were conducting diplomacy, and diplomacy, like the ledgers of Spain's treasure fleets in another of our stories, records exactly the kind of dry practical detail that legend has no use for and history cannot do without. We know, from a treaty preserved in the Hittite archive and dated to around the year 1280 before Christ, that Wilusa had, at that time, a local king named Alexandu, a name so strikingly close to Alexandros, the alternate Greek name the poems themselves give to Paris, Prince of Troy, that scholars have argued for decades over how much weight the resemblance can honestly bear. And the treaty itself, a formal document in which the Hittite great king guarantees to protect Alexandu's throne, and his descendants in exchange for Wilusa's loyalty and military support, tells us that this western kingdom mattered enough to the Hittite Empire, sat close enough to a contested and strategically vital frontier, that the empire's own supreme ruler considered it worth binding by a formal, sworn treaty rather than simply ignoring. We know, from other tablets, that the Hittites were engaged, across roughly 2 centuries, in an intermittent low-grade rivalry with a power they called Ahhiyawa, a name that a great many, though not quite all, specialists now believe refers to the Mycenaean Greeks themselves, Ahhiyawa being read by many scholars as a Hittite rendering of a word very close to Achaeans, the very name Homer uses, again and again, for his own Greek warriors, and one particularly tantalizing letter from the Hittite king to the ruler of Ahhiyawa mentions, in passing, a past dispute over a place called Wilusa that had, the letter says, already caused conflict between the 2 powers once before, a single, dry, administrative sentence that is, so far as the entire surviving written record of the Bronze Age world allows us to say anything at all, the closest thing we possess to a contemporary, non-poetic, non-legendary reference to something that might, in the most cautious and heavily qualified language a historian can use, have been an actual historical conflict between the Greek world and the city later poets would call Troy. We should be honest here about exactly how much weight that single sentence can carry, because it would be a disservice to you, and to the whole spirit of how this channel tries to tell a story, to let one tantalizing letter stand in for a certainty that evidence does not actually offer. The Hittite tablets do not mention a 10-year siege. They do not mention a horse, or a stolen queen, or a wrathful, glorious Achilles, or any of the individual names and deeds that make the Iliad the Iliad, rather than a dry border dispute between two Bronze Age powers. What they give us, at most, and it is genuinely a great deal more than scholars had any right to expect a century ago, is a plausible historical skeleton onto which a much later poetic tradition appears to have hung an enormous and largely invented body of flesh. A real Western Anatolian kingdom called Wilusa, likely identical with the Ilion of the poems, a real king with a name disturbingly close to the poem's alternate name for Paris, a real and recurring pattern of friction between that kingdom's Hittite overlords and a Greek-speaking power to the west, and in the archaeological layers at Hisarlik itself, a real city, in more or less the right place, that grew to real size and real prosperity and was, in fact, burned by human hands rather than mere accident, at more or less the right time. It is not proof that Achilles existed, or that Helen was ever real, or that any single event the Iliad describes happened as described. It is proof, or as close to proof as 3,000-year-old evidence of this kind ever gets, that the world the poem is set in was real, that a city very like the one it describes stood where the poem says it stood, and burned, when the poem says, in its own roundabout mythic chronology, that it burned, and that somewhere underneath 3 centuries of oral retelling and poetic embellishment, there is very likely a kernel, however small, however transformed, of an actual conflict between an actual Western Anatolian city and actual Greek-speaking raiders or invaders from across the sea, and it did not burn alone. This is the piece of the puzzle that later 20th century scholarship added to the picture, and it is, in its own quiet way, one of the most sobering discoveries in the whole of this story, because it places Troy's own fall inside a catastrophe far larger than any single city, a catastrophe that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean world in the space of a few decades around the very same period, roughly 1200 to 1150 before Christ, that modern scholars now call, simply and starkly, the Late Bronze Age collapse. In those decades, one after another, the great palace civilizations that had dominated the region for centuries fell, and fell hard. The Hittite Empire itself, the very power whose archives preserve our best evidence for Troy's real name, collapsed entirely, its capital abandoned and burned, its once vast territory fragmenting into a scatter of smaller successor states. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the very citadels of Mycenae and Pylos and Tiryns that had sent, if the tradition is even roughly right, the fleet that sacked Troy, were themselves destroyed or abandoned within a generation or two of Troy's own fall, plunging the Greek world into the genuine dark age we're going to spend real time on later tonight. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was destroyed so suddenly and so completely that clay tablets baked hard in its final fire have been found, still sitting in the kiln where a scribe had left them to harden, an unfinished letter describing enemy ships approaching the coast and pleading for help that never came. And even Egypt, the oldest and most resilient of all the great Bronze Age powers, though it survived only after fighting off wave after wave of a mysterious disparate coalition of raiders and migrants that Egyptian inscriptions call, without ever quite explaining who they were or where they had truly come from, the Sea Peoples, a label modern historians still argue over, some seeing them as organised invaders, others as refugees and pirates set loose by the very same collapse they are so often blamed for causing. Correlation and causation tangled together so thoroughly, across a genuine dark age with almost no surviving written record to sort them out, that we may never fully untangle which came first, the collapse or the raiders. Sit with that for a moment because it reframes everything this whole night has told you so far. The war the poems remember as the single, defining catastrophe of its age, worth 10 years and 1,000 ships and the deaths of the finest heroes 2 civilizations could produce, took place, so far as the best current archaeology and history can determine, not as an isolated tragedy in an otherwise stable world, but as one city's fall inside a much vaster unravelling, an entire interconnected civilization, Hittites and Mycenaeans and Egyptians and a dozen smaller powers besides, bound together for centuries by trade routes and diplomatic marriages and treaties just like the one that bound Wilusa to the Hittite throne, coming apart within the span of a single human lifetime, for reasons that historians still debate with real uncertainty even now. Climate change and prolonged drought disrupting the grain harvests. Every one of these palace economies depended on. Earthquake storms, a real and recognised geological phenomenon in which one major quake triggers a cascading series of others along a connected fault system, toppling walls from Greece to the Levant within the same narrow window of years. The breakdown of the very trade networks that had made Bronze Age civilization possible in the first place, since bronze itself requires tin, and tin in that world had to be carried by ship and caravan across enormous distances, so that any sufficiently severe disruption of trade could cripple the ability of every palace economy in the network to arm its own soldiers. An internal social collapse, ordinary people, ground down by generations of taxation and forced labour, to support increasingly militarised and increasingly brittle palace elites, simply withdrawing their loyalty or their labour, or both, at the exact moment their kings could least afford it. No single explanation, offered alone, has ever satisfied every scholar who has studied this collapse, and the truth, as it so often is in the stories this channel tells, is very likely some tangled combination of several or all of these causes at once. Climate and earthquake and broken trade and internal unrest, each making the others worse, in exactly the compounding, self-reinforcing way that real catastrophes, as opposed to the clean single-cause catastrophes of legend, actually tend to unfold. If that is anywhere close to the truth, then the Trojan War the poems remember, the 10-year siege, the wrath of Achilles, the horse, was very possibly not the cause of anything at all, in the grand scheme of the era, but a symptom, one skirmish, larger perhaps than most, in a world already sliding toward a wider and far less glamorous collapse. A raid or a siege that would, in a more stable age, have been remembered, if it was remembered at all, as one border conflict among many, the kind of dispute the Hittite archive mentions in a single dry sentence and then moves on from, and that was instead remembered and remembered and remembered, generation after generation through the dark centuries that followed, precisely because it came to stand in the minds of the people who survived that collapse and told their children about the world before it. For the whole vanished age itself, every lost palace and every fallen wall, and every unexplained silence compressed by the alchemy of memory and grief that this channel has watched at work in story after story, into the fall of one particular city, one particular war, small enough for a human mind to hold and grand enough to carry the weight of everything that had actually been lost. 400 years of silence. To understand how that compression happened, how a probable border skirmish inside a civilizational collapse became, centuries later, the most famous war in the history of Western literature, we have to follow the story down into the very darkness the collapse itself created. Because the Greek world that emerged from the wreckage of the Bronze Age did not emerge quickly, and it did not emerge remembering how to write. This is one of the strangest and most consequential facts in this entire story, and it deserves to be said plainly, because it is easy, sitting in a literate age, to forget how fragile literacy itself can be. The Mycenaean Greeks of the Bronze Age had writing, the syllabic script called Linear B that we mentioned earlier tonight, the very script that let modern scholars recover the palace inventories of Pylos and Knossos, oil and wool and chariot wheels counted out in painstaking bureaucratic detail. But Linear B was never a script for poetry, or for history, or for anything resembling literature as we would recognise it. It was a script for palace administration, taught to a small class of professional scribes for the narrow purpose of tracking the palace's own wealth, and when the palaces themselves burned, in that same collapse that took Troy down with everything else, the scribble schools that had taught Linear B burned with them, and the script, having never been used for anything beyond palace accounting, and having no life outside the palace walls that had employed it, simply vanished from Greece entirely, not gradually, but essentially all at once. So completely that for more than 3,000 years afterward, until a brilliant amateur named Michael Ventris finally deciphered it in 1952, working from photographs of clay tablets and comparing patterns with the patient, obsessive rigour of a man solving a puzzle for its own sake, no living person anywhere in the world could read a single word the Mycenaean Greeks had ever written down. For roughly 400 years after the collapse, then, a period modern historians simply and honestly call the Greek Dark Age, because it is dark to us in the most literal sense, a period from which almost no written record survives at all. The Greek world had no writing whatsoever. Population fell. Trade with the wider Mediterranean world, once so extensive that Mycenaean pottery has been found from Italy to the Levant, contracted drastically. The great stone palaces stood empty and crumbling, and the people who lived in their shadow in smaller, poorer, more scattered communities told each other, "We can only assume that giants must once have built them," the same story the later Spanish would tell of the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae in another of our night stories. A folk memory preserving the fact of a lost grandeur while losing almost everything true about the grandeur itself. And it was into this long darkness, this genuine and prolonged forgetting, that the memory of Troy's fall and of the whole world that had surrounded it, the great kings and their gold-masked faces, the palace economies and their fleets, the strait that had been worth fighting a war over, had to survive. And it survived the only way anything can survive 4 centuries with no writing to hold it steady. By being spoken, aloud, from one generation to the next, shaped and reshaped with every single telling by singers whose entire art was memory. These singers, the Greeks called them oidoi, and later, once the tradition had crystallized into something closer to what we now call Homer, rhapsodes, and their craft, which modern scholars, studying still living oral epic traditions in places like the 20th century Balkans, have been able to reconstruct with real precision, was not memorization in the sense we would mean it today. A bard reciting a fixed text word for word from unchanging memory, but something far more fluid and far more remarkable, a technique built around a vast reservoir of ready-made phrases, fixed epithets and formulaic lines and whole stock scenes, swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, that fit the strict metrical demands of the poetic line, called dactylic hexameter, so precisely that a skilled singer could reach for exactly the right formula to fill exactly the right rhythmic gap without ever pausing to think, the way a skilled jazz musician reaches for a familiar phrase mid-improvisation. Not because the phrase is being recalled from a fixed score, but because the musician has so thoroughly internalized the grammar of the form that the right notes simply arrive, in the moment, shaped by the demands of the music itself. A singer trained in this tradition did not recite the Iliad. He composed it, fresh, every single time he sang it, out of a vast inherited toolkit of story and phrase and formula, so that no 2 performances, across the whole 400 years of the Dark Age and beyond, were ever likely to have been word for word identical, and the poem we now call the Iliad, fixed at last in writing, represents not the one true original version of a story that had always existed in exactly that form, but a single snapshot, however magnificent, of a living, breathing, constantly reshaping oral tradition, caught, almost by accident of history, at one particular moment in its long evolution, and frozen there forever by the invention, or rather the reintroduction, of writing to the Greek world. That reintroduction came, so far as the evidence allows us to date it, sometime in the 8th century before Christ, several centuries after the fall of the Troy the archaeologists have identified, when Greek traders and travellers, in contact once again with the wider eastern Mediterranean world after centuries of relative isolation, encountered the alphabet the Phoenicians had developed, a script radically different from anything the Greeks had used before, not syllabic like the old lost linear B, but built from a small set of individual letters representing individual sounds, and adapted it, with one crucial innovation, the addition of true vowel letters that the Phoenician original had lacked, into what became the Greek alphabet, the direct ancestor, by a chain of borrowing and adaptation stretching through Etruscan and Roman hands of the very alphabet this sentence is written in. And it was sometime in the century or two after that reintroduction of writing. Most scholars now believe, though the exact date and the exact circumstances remain, and will very likely always remain, genuinely and permanently uncertain, that the Iliad and the Odyssey were finally set down in something close to the form we now possess, whether dictated by a single extraordinarily gifted singer to an early scribe eager to capture a performance too magnificent to let vanish into the air the way every performance before it had, or gradually assembled and standardized over generations by a whole school of poets working in a shared tradition and gradually converging through the ordinary pressures of competition and repeated performance at religious festivals on something close to a fixed and authoritative text. Which brings us, at last, to the question every visitor to this story eventually asks, and that honest scholarship has never been able to answer with real confidence. Who, in fact, was Homer? The ancient Greeks themselves were not at all certain. 7 different cities, in the old joke that was already old by the time of the Roman Empire, competed for the honour of having been his birthplace. A competition that tells you plainly that no one, even in antiquity, actually knew, and later ages have proposed everything from a single blind genius. The tradition's own favourite image of him, composing both epics whole out of his own singular vision, to a loose confederation of many different poets across many different generations, working within the same formulaic tradition, and gradually credited as a kind of convenient shorthand, with a single collective name, to the more moderate and now more widely accepted position among specialists that there may indeed have been one particular singer of extraordinary skill, working near the very end of the oral tradition's long life, who took the accumulated inheritance of centuries of anonymous predecessors and shaped it through his own individual genius for structure and character, and the almost unbearable psychological weight he gives to moments like Priam's visit to Achilles' tent, into the 2 towering poems that alone, of all the epics the larger tradition once contained, survived. We will very likely never know for certain, and it is worth saying gently that this uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, so much as an honest reflection of how oral traditions actually work. Traditions with no single author in the way a modern novel has a single author, but a whole chain of contributors reaching back into a darkness no name was ever recorded to illuminate, so that asking who wrote the Iliad may be, in the end, a little like asking who first sang a particular folk song. A question that assumes a kind of individual documented authorship that the oral world the poem itself came out of never actually possessed. What we can say, with rather more confidence, is what those poems meant to the Greek world that finally did write them down and keep them, copying and recopying them by hand for well over 1,000 years, before the invention of printing, reciting them at religious festivals, teaching them to school children as the foundation of a proper education, quoting them in courtrooms and in philosophy and in ordinary conversation, the way people in some other cultures might quote scripture, because the Iliad and the Odyssey were not, to the Greeks who inherited them, merely entertaining stories about a long-ago war. They were something closer to a shared cultural Bible, without any single church or priesthood to enforce their authority, a common inheritance that every Greek city, however fiercely it might otherwise quarrel with its neighbours, could recognise as belonging equally to all of them. The closest thing the fractious, endlessly warring city-states of later Greece ever had to a single national epic, and it is worth remembering as we move now toward the end of tonight's long journey, that this is precisely the kind of cultural weight that lets a story survive not merely for centuries but for millennia. Not because it happened exactly as told, but because a whole civilization needed it to have happened, needed a shared past grand enough and tragic enough and human enough to hold up a mirror to its own values, its own fears, its own understanding of what glory costs and what it is in the end actually worth. The argument that never quite ends. It would be tidy at this point in the story to say that the archaeology settled the question once and for all, that Schliemann's shovel and Blagan's careful stratigraphy and the Hittite tablets together close the case, and that scholars today simply agree that yes, there was a Trojan War, more or less where and more or less when the tradition always said. It would be tidy, and it would not be true, and this channel has never much cared for tidiness when the honest picture is messier, because the truth is that the argument over how much of this story to believe has never actually stopped, not in the 18th century, not in Schliemann's own lifetime, and not now, and one particularly public and rather bitter chapter of that argument played out remarkably only a little more than 2 decades ago, among scholars very much alive within living memory, in a dispute that came to be known in the German academic press that covered it with unusual public relish as the Troy controversy. It began in the year 2001, when a German ancient historian named Frank Kolb, reviewing the findings that Manfred Kaufmann's team had been publishing about the newly discovered lower town at Hisarlik, the outer settlement that had so dramatically expanded the site's apparent size and importance, stood up and said, in effect, that he did not believe it, or rather, that he believed Kaufmann and his team were overstating, for reasons Kolb was not shy about attributing to a wish for exactly the kind of public fame and funding that had always attended dramatic Trojan discoveries since Schliemann's own day, the true scale and significance of what they had actually found. Kolb argued that Hisarlik, even accounting for the newly identified lower town, remained a comparatively modest regional stronghold, not the great trade-controlling metropolis of the poems, and that the popular narrative building up around Kaufmann's work, a narrative eagerly amplified by German newspapers and television documentaries, hungry for exactly the kind of vivid, myth-confirming story this whole tradition has always attracted, was running well ahead of what the actual evidence in the ground could support. The dispute grew heated enough, and public enough, that it spilled out of specialist journals and into general newspapers into a public debate hosted at the University of Tübingen that drew an overflow crowd eager to watch 2 respected scholars argue, in terms considerably less measured than academic convention usually permits, about how big a Bronze Age hill fort actually needs to have been to justify 3,000 years of poetry. We tell you about this recent, rather undignified quarrel not to settle it, because it is not this channel's place to referee a dispute that trained specialists, with access to evidence we have not personally examined, have not fully settled themselves, but because it illustrates something important about the whole shape of this night's story. That the pull this particular tale exerts, the wish to know, finally and certainly, whether Achilles and Hector and Helen were in some sense real, has never weakened, not across 3,000 years of retelling, not across a century and a half of increasingly careful archaeology, and that the wish is strong enough to bend even careful, credentialed modern scholars toward positions considerably more confident than the fragmentary, ambiguous, genuinely uncertain evidence can fully justify in precisely the same way, though we should be fair and say to a far less extreme degree, that it once bent Heinrich Schliemann toward announcing he had found Priam's own treasure in a hoard that almost certainly was never any single king's at all. The most honest current position, the one most careful specialists in Bronze Age Aegean archaeology and Hittitology now actually hold, sits somewhere in the patient, unglamorous middle ground between Kolb's scepticism and the more romantic certainties of popular retellings, that Hisarlik was very likely a real, moderately significant regional centre, larger than earlier excavation had shown, but probably smaller than the poem's most inflated numbers suggest, that it stood in a genuinely strategic location controlling access to the Strait and the Black Sea, trade beyond it, wealth enough to be worth fighting over without needing to have been the single, richest city in the Bronze Age world, that it was destroyed, at least once and very possibly more than once across its long, repeatedly rebuilt history, by human violence rather than accident alone, and that's some kind of recurring friction, raiding, siege, perhaps outright war between the Greek-speaking Mycenaean world and this corner of Western Anatolia is not merely plausible, but is directly and independently attested in the dry administrative language of people who had no reason at all to be writing propaganda for either side in the Hittite archive itself. Beyond that careful, hedged, thoroughly unglamorous summary, certainty runs out, and every particular hero, every particular duel, the horse itself, belongs, so far as the evidence we currently possess can tell us, to the realm the poets always claimed for it. Not lie, exactly, but something the ancient Greeks themselves had a better word for than we do, mythos, a sacred and shaping story that was never quite meant to be checked against a ledger in the first place. No simple villains. Let us turn back now from the mound and the tablets and the arguing scholars to the poem itself, because there is a fairness in the Iliad that deserves tonight its own separate telling, a fairness that becomes only more remarkable the longer you sit with it, because it was composed, so far as we can tell, entirely by and for the descendants of the victors, Greek singers performing for Greek audiences who traced their own ancestry, real or invented, back to the very warriors camped on that beach. And yet the poem those singers built refuses, at nearly every turn, to give its own side the easy moral high ground a victor's story so naturally reaches for. We have already spent a great part of tonight with Hector, and it is worth saying plainly what that choice means. The single, most sympathetic, most fully human, most quietly heroic figure in the entire epic is not a Greek at all, but the defender of the city the poem's own first audiences understood to be, in the end, their own ancestors' rightful prize. Homer gives Hector a wife who loves him, and a son who reaches for him, and a father who begs him not to die, and gives him too a moment of very human fear. 3 full circuits fled around his own city's walls, before he can make himself stand and face a man he already knows will kill him. A fear the poem does not treat as shameful, but as simply, achingly true to what it feels like to be a mortal man facing a death he cannot avoid. And it is worth asking, honestly, how many other warrior epics from how many other ancient traditions would have dared let their own side's greatest enemy be shown running from a fight, and let him remain, even so, the noblest man in the poem. Nor does the poem let its own heroes off lightly, and this too is a fairness worth naming, because it is easy, retelling only the broad outlines of glory and conquest, to forget how unsparingly the poem itself judges the men fighting on what its own audience would have called the right side. Agamemnon is petty and proud and makes, again and again, exactly the decisions a wiser commander would not make, insulting a priest, humiliating his own greatest warrior, nearly losing the entire war through his own wounded pride, and the poem never once pretends that his authority makes him wise. Achilles, for all his glory, is shown dragging a defeated man's corpse around a tomb, in a grief so excessive it frightens even the gods, refusing a dying man's simple, decent request, and the poem does not ask us to admire that cruelty, only to understand where, in a particular kind of unbearable grief, it comes from, and to watch, in Priam's tent, exactly what it costs Achilles to find his way back to something like mercy. Even the war's very cause is treated throughout the poem with a weariness that borders on outright skepticism. Helen herself, walking the walls of Troy with the old men of the city in one of the poem's most striking scenes, weeps and calls herself a shameless thing, wishes she had died before ever coming to Troy at all, and the old men, watching her, murmur to one another that no one could blame the Trojans and the well-armed Greeks for suffering so long over a woman who looks like that, a line that has been read across the centuries, both as an old man's helpless tribute to unbearable beauty, and as one of the driest, saddest jokes in the whole poem, an entire war's worth of suffering measured by the very men dying in it, against a single face, and found, the tone leaves carefully ambiguous, either fully or not remotely worth the cost. This studied even-handedness runs all the way down to the poem's treatment of the gods themselves, who take sides in this war with exactly the partisan pettiness of quarrelling relatives, rather than the clear moral authority a simpler kind of story might have given them. Hera and Athena backing the Greeks out of an old grudge over a golden apple that had nothing to do with justice at all. Apollo and Aphrodite backing the Trojans for reasons just as personal and just as unconcerned with which side actually deserves to win, so that the poem denies its own audience even the comfort of believing that heaven itself has judged the war's outcome to be right. And later Greek writers, working in the centuries after Homer, only deepen this refusal to let either side monopolise sympathy or blame. We have already mentioned Euripides and his Trojan women, staged for an Athenian audience in the very years that Athens itself, at the height of a long and increasingly brutal war with Sparta, had voted to put every adult man on the small island of Melos to death and enslave every woman and child simply for refusing to submit to Athenian rule. A contemporary atrocity the play never mentions by name, but that its first audience could not possibly have watched the fall of Troy without thinking of, and it is one of the most striking facts in the whole history of ancient literature that a civilization capable of committing an atrocity very like the one this 3,000-year-old story describes was, in that same civilization, capable of putting that atrocity on its own stage and asking its own citizens to grieve, at length and without any comforting distance, for the women on the losing side of it. That capacity for both-handed honesty, for loving your own side's heroes without pretending your own side's cause was simply, uncomplicatedly just, is one of the quiet reasons this particular war has outlasted 1,000 other Bronze Age conflicts the ancient world once knew, and has since entirely forgotten. It never let itself become a simple story of good men against bad men, and simple stories, this channel has learned across every long night it has spent in rooms like this one, are the stories that age the fastest and are believed the least. Whose glory was it? And yet there is a ledger this whole tradition, for all its remarkable fairness between Greek and Trojan, never fully opens, and it is the ledger this channel tries never to close a story without reading. The ledger of who, exactly, paid for the glory that both sides of this war are so lavishly given, and paid without ever once being asked whether the price was one they would have chosen. For the Trojan War, whatever else it was, a myth grown from a real Bronze Age border conflict or a poet's grand invention layered over the ashes of a collapsed civilization, was, at its centre, a war about the ownership of a woman, fought by men who then spent 10 years treating every other woman they encountered exactly as they had treated the first, as property to be seized, distributed, and fought over when the distribution went wrong. We have already met Chryseis and Briseis, whose exchange between two proud men opens the entire epic, and it is worth sitting, one more time, with how little either woman is permitted to say about her own fate in a poem that will spend 15,000 lines on the wounded feelings of the men who own them. Briseis is given exactly one speech of her own in the whole of the Iliad, near its very end, a lament spoken over the body of Patroclus, the one man in that camp, she tells us, who had ever treated her gently, who had promised, she says, to make her Achilles' own lawful wife rather than merely his captive once they returned home to Greece. A single, small, devastating window into an interior life the poem otherwise gives us almost no access to at all. A woman mourning the death of her kindest captor because he was in a world that had taken absolutely everything else from her, the nearest thing she had left to safety. Multiply that single captive woman by every city Achilles is said to have sacked in the 9 years the poems barely tell, by every allied town whose fall the tradition mentions only in passing on the way to some grander scene, by the thousands upon thousands of ordinary Trojan women, nameless in every surviving account, who were carried off from their own burning city in that final night alongside Hecuba and Andromache and Cassandra, and you begin to see the shape of a truth the poems themselves gesture toward without ever quite forcing their audience to look at directly. that this entire war, sung for 3,000 years as a story of heroism and honour and glory undying, was also, and just as truly, one of the largest and most sustained campaigns of mass enslavement the Bronze Age Aegean world ever produced. An economy of captured women running underneath the whole grand narrative of duelling champions, the way the meter ran underneath the silver of Potosi in another of our night's stories. Unglamorous, largely uncounted, and utterly indispensable to how the war actually sustained itself, since a besieging army camped on a foreign shore for a decade needed labour and food and the ordinary domestic work of a functioning camp every bit as much as it needed spears, and it was captured women, overwhelmingly, who were made to supply it. The heroes get names and speeches and funerals and 3,000 years of readers weeping for them. The women mostly do not, and it is worth noticing honestly which women the tradition does trouble to individualise and why. Helen, because her face is the engine the whole plot runs on. Andromache and Hecuba and Cassandra, because their grief gives the fall of Troy its moral weight and its warning. Briseis, in that one brief lament, because her sorrow serves to deepen our understanding of Achilles' own loss. Almost never are we given a captive woman's interiority for her own sake alone, uncoupled from what her suffering illuminates about the men around her, and that asymmetry, a war remembered in loving, individual 3,000-year detail for its warrior heroes, and remembered only in aggregate, if it is remembered at all, for the women whose whole lives those heroes rearrange with a spear point is not a flaw unique to this one ancient poem. It is, this channel has found on night after night in story after story, very nearly the default setting of how history gets told at all, whose names get written down and whose do not, and the honest thing to do with a 3,000-year-old poem that already, remarkably, gives us more of that missing interiority than almost any other epic of its age dared attempt. Briseis' single lament, Andromache's terror on the walls, Helen's own weary self-judgment, is not to pretend the imbalance isn't there, but to notice gratefully how much further even this even-handed, humane, extraordinary poem could have gone, and did not, because the world that made it, like the world that made almost every epic, every ancient civilization ever produced, simply did not think a captive woman's own account of her own captivity was, in the end, the story most worth the telling. Voices from the palace ledgers. There is, however, one place where some of those uncounted ordinary lives do survive, in fragments, not through the grand medium of epic poetry, but through the same dry, unglamorous, bureaucratic record-keeping that has given us so much of tonight's real history, and it is worth pausing here, before we move toward the end of this long night, to listen to it, because the Linear B tablets that Michael Ventris finally deciphered in 1952 do not tell us anything at all about Achilles or Hector, or a wooden horse, but they tell us something the epics never trouble to, which is what ordinary life inside a Mycenaean palace economy, the very kind of world the Greek expedition against Troy would have sailed out from, actually looked like from the inside, for the people who are never going to be sung about by any poet at all. The tablets from the Palace of Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, ruled in the poems by wise old Nestor, the elder statesman of the Greek army, whose long speeches of counsel Homer clearly enjoyed composing rather more than his own audiences, probably enjoyed hearing them, record, in painstaking bureaucratic detail, the palace's own workforce, and they record it, we should say plainly, with exactly the cold, inventory-taking indifference to individual humanity that a warehouse ledger brings to counting sacks of grain, because that is precisely what these tablets were built to do. We find lists of women workers, hundreds of them, organised into labour gangs and identified not by name, in the way we would recognise, but by occupation and by the town of their origin, spinners and weavers and grinders of grain, bath attendants, and in a category that has struck every modern scholar who has read these tablets as almost unbearably poignant once its full implication is understood, women listed under headings that name distant Anatolian coastal towns, women whose scholars now believe were themselves captives, taken in exactly the kind of coastal raiding the Iliad describes Achilles conducting against Troy's own neighbouring cities, brought back across the Aegean to grind grain and spin wool for a Mycenaean palace, their children listed alongside them on the same ration rolls, boys and girls both, already being tallied. The tablets suggest for the specific future labour the palace expected to extract from them once they were old enough to work. Here then, in cold administrative linear B, rather than in glorious dactylic hexameter, is Briseis's world laid bare in aggregate rather than individual grief, the ordinary unglamorous entirely real economic machinery that the poem's single lamenting captive stands in for. Women taken from the same stretch of Anatolian coastline the war itself would later be set on, generations before or after or, quite possibly, during the very period the war's dimmest historical kernel belongs to, put to work in palace textile operations that we now know, from the sheer scale the tablets record. Thousands of women listed at a single palace alone were not some minor sideline of the Mycenaean economy, but one of its central engines, cloth being in the Bronze Age Aegean, as in so many other early economies, one of the most valuable and most exportable goods a palace could produce, so that the wealth and glory of a Mycenaean king, the very wealth that let him arm ships and fight wars and be remembered centuries later as rich in gold, rested in no small part on exactly the kind of anonymous, coerced, female labour that the epic tradition mentions only when a particular captive happens to catch a particular hero's eye. The tablets give us other lives too, in the same cold, precious fragments. Perfume makers, mixing scented oils by recipes the tablets record with a chemist's precision. Bronze smiths, drawing rations of raw metal from the palace stores and returning finished goods, their individual output tracked with a care that suggests the palace trusted them, rather less than it valued the bronze itself. Shepherds, tending flocks numbering in the tens of thousands, whose wool fed the very textile workshops the captive women staffed. Rowers and shipwrights, the men whose ordinary, back-breaking, entirely unglamorous labour built and crewed the ships that a poem like the Iliad can list in its grand catalogue, as though 1,000 vessels simply appeared, fully built and fully crewed, the moment a king wished for them. None of these people have names that survive to us as names, in the way Achilles has a name, though a very few individual names do flicker up out of the tablets here and there, a scribe's own hand recording, almost despite the form's own coldness, some fragment of a real human transaction, a woman named in a ration list. A rower owed a particular allotment of grain for a particular voyage. Small, mundane, utterly unpoetic facts that have nonetheless outlived, in their own quiet way, the empire that recorded them. It is worth holding both of these bodies of evidence side by side tonight, the epic and the ledger, the sung and the counted, because together they give us something neither one alone ever could. The epic gives us the meaning this war came to carry, the grief and the glory and the terrible cost of pride, everything a human heart actually needs a story to hold. And the ledger gives us the machinery that made a war like this thinkable at all, the palace economies and the captive labour and the ordinary unsung people whose lives fed the whole glittering apparatus of heroism without ever once being asked whether they wished to. Neither account, alone, is the whole truth. The epic without the ledger lets us believe this was only ever a story of individual honour and individual grief, clean and human-scaled and moving. The ledger without the epic lets us believe it was only ever brute economics, cold and structural and drained of any of the meaning 3,000 years of readers have found in it. it is only holding both together, the way this channel has tried to hold together the sung and the counted in every long story it has told, that you begin to see the war whole, a real or half-real conflict fought by real human beings capable of exactly the love and grief and pride the poems give them, sustained underneath all that grandeur by an economy of coerced and largely anonymous labour that the poems mostly chose not to look at too closely, and remembered for 3,000 years afterward, almost entirely in the register of the first and almost never in the register of the second. A war that never stopped being fought. Every long story this channel tells eventually has to answer the question of what happened to it afterward, once the events themselves were over, and the Trojan War answers that question more thoroughly and stranger than almost any story we have taken up in this room, because it did not simply get remembered, it got used over and over by nearly every civilization that came after the Greeks, each one reaching back into this one war for whatever it happened to need at the time, the way we have already watched Augustan Rome reach back into it for a founding myth grand enough to dwarf its own recent and rather less glamorous history. The medieval world, centuries later, cut off from direct knowledge of Greek, and largely unable to read Homer at all, nonetheless kept the war alive through Latin retellings, and through a strange, persistent medieval fascination with Troy as an ancestral homeland, so that noble families across Britain and France, in the centuries after the fall of Rome, invented for themselves elaborate genealogies tracing their own bloodlines back to Trojan refugees, exactly as Aeneas had once been made the ancestor of Rome. A legendary figure named Brutus of Troy, said to be Aeneas's own great-grandson, was credited by medieval British chroniclers with founding Britain itself and giving the island his own name, and the city of London was, for a time, seriously called New Troy by writers eager to claim the same ancient, glorious pedigree that Virgil had once given to Rome. It is worth marvelling tonight at how strange and how persistent that impulse turned out to be. A burned Bronze Age city on the coast of Asia Minor becoming, across 3,000 years and thousands of miles, the imagined ancestral homeland of dynasties in England and France that had not the faintest genuine historical connection to it at all, connected only by the same old human hunger, the hunger Rome had already shown, for a past ancient and grand enough to dignify a present that felt by comparison merely ordinary, and the language itself never let the war go. We speak still, without a second thought, of a Trojan horse, and mean by it exactly what Sinon's lie once meant, a gift that conceals an attack, a danger smuggled inside the very defences meant to keep danger out, a phrase so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary speech that it has been given, in our own age, to an entire category of malicious computer software, programs that disguise themselves as safe or useful files, while secretly carrying out an attack from inside a system's own trusted walls, a use of the ancient image so apt that most people who type the words Trojan Horse into a search engine today, worried about their own computer's security, have likely never read a line of Homer and would be mildly astonished to learn exactly how old the metaphor they are using actually is. We speak of an Achilles' heel, a single hidden weakness in an otherwise formidable strength, though we now know, as we mentioned earlier tonight, that the heel itself was a detail added centuries after Homer by poets reaching for a crueler irony than the original poem ever needed. We speak of a Cassandra, meaning someone who sees a coming disaster clearly and is not believed, a figure this channel has found itself returning to, in one form or another, in nearly every catastrophe it has ever told, the artristas of Habsburg Spain shelved and ignored, the newspapers of a wooden American city warning of exactly the fire that would one day consume it, every long human catastrophe, it seems, keeping its own Cassandra somewhere near the centre of it, seeing clearly and speaking plainly, and being believed by no one at all until it is far too late for the warning to matter. And we speak still of helping to launch 1,000 ships, of the face that launched them, borrowing, whether we know it or not, directly from a line an English playwright named Christopher Marlowe, wrote about Helen more than 400 years ago, a phrase that has outlived the play it came from, and very nearly outlived the memory that it came from a play at all, absorbed so completely into the ordinary language of praise and blame that most people who use it now could not tell you where it began. The story itself, meanwhile, never stopped being retold, in every medium each new age had available to it. Greek vase painters, in the centuries immediately after Homer, covered the pottery of ordinary households with scenes from this one war. Achilles and Ajax bent over a game of dice, Priam kneeling before Achilles, the horse itself being wheeled through the gates, so that the story was not confined to poetry recited at grand festivals, but lived, in miniature, on the cups and jars of everyday Greek life. Athenian tragedians, across the 5th century before Christ, mined the war and its aftermath for material again and again. Aeschylus giving us Agamemnon's murder, Sophocles giving us Ajax's shame and suicide, Euripides giving us Trojan women and Hecuba, and half a dozen other plays that returned, obsessively to the war's cruelest and most complicated corners. Because a war this large and this morally unresolved turned out to contain enough human material to fuel an entire dramatic tradition for 100 years without ever exhausting it. Roman poets, Virgil above all, remade the story as their own civilization's founding myth. Medieval poets remade Troilus, a minor Trojan prince the ancient tradition barely mentions, into the hero of an entirely new medieval romance about doomed love. A story Geoffrey Chaucer and, later, William Shakespeare himself both took up in turn, each finding in this 3,000-year-old war material that still, somehow, had something new to say about love and betrayal, and the particular folly of young men in wartime. And in our own age, the story has been filmed and novelised and reimagined from the perspective of its silenced women in a whole recent wave of retellings that have finally, after 3,000 years, begun to do in fiction some of what this channel has tried to do tonight in fact, giving voice at last to Briseis and Cassandra and Andromache in their own right, rather than only as reflections of the men who owned them. It's worth asking, as we did once before tonight about Spain Silver, why this particular war, out of every Bronze Age conflict the ancient world once knew and has mostly forgotten, proved durable enough to be worth all of this, generation after generation, civilization after civilization, still finding new uses for it 3,000 years on. And the answer, we think, is the same answer that has run underneath this whole night's telling, because the poems that first fixed it in memory never let it become a simple story, gave both sides real grief and real dignity and real fault, gave its heroes glory, and also showed unflinchingly exactly what that glory costs the men who chase it and the people who are merely standing nearby when it arrives, and a story built with that much honesty in it. This channel has come to believe does not age the way a simpler, more flattering story does. It keeps finding new centuries willing to listen to it, because it was never really only about one war, or one horse, or one stolen woman at all. Walking back through the whole long war, it may help, before the last reflections of the night, to walk the whole story once more, quickly and in order, the way we like to on this channel, before we let a long tale close, because tonight has ranged across 3,000 years and more. From a goddess's uninvited apple to a computer virus named for a wooden horse, and seeing the shape of it laid end to end reveals a pattern that no single scene, told alone, can quite show you. It begins, in the world before the war, with a Bronze Age Aegean of gold-masked kings and towering stone citadels, a warrior aristocracy that prized glory won in a single stroke, above wealth, built slowly, standing across a narrow sea from a small vassal kingdom called Wilusa, tributary to the great Hittite Empire, sitting astride a strait worth fighting over long before any poet ever gave that fight a woman's face. It moves into myth with a golden apple thrown by an uninvited goddess of discord, a shepherd prince's careless judgment, and an oath sworn by a room full of ambitious suitors that would, years later, call every one of them away from their own kingdoms to defend a marriage most of them had no personal stake in at all. It gathers its fleet at Aulis, becalmed until a king paid a wind's price in his own daughter's blood, a debt that would not be forgotten and would not, in the end, go unanswered. It spends 9 years in a siege the poems barely tell, grinding and seasonal and sustained by raids on Troy's own allies, before narrowing, in its most towering surviving poem, into the final weeks of the 10th year and the wrath of a single wronged man. It gives us Hector, the best of the Trojans, dying to defend a home he never chose to be born the defender of, and Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks, learning, through the death of the friend he loved most, that no treasure on earth was worth the quarrel that had cost him. It gives us a night of grief and mercy in a tent between a killer and a father, and then, once that great poem falls silent, an Amazon queen and an Ethiopian king, and, at last, Achilles himself, brought down not in fair combat but by an arrow guided, the tradition insists, by a god's own hand. It gives us a horse that was never a gift, built by cunning rather than force after 10 years, had proven that force alone could never take those walls, and a night of fire and slaughter that ended a kingdom in the hours it takes an exhausted, celebrating city to fall asleep. It scatters its victors across a hostile sea, brings one king home to a wife's axe and one king's son to a court that finally broke, after 3 generations of blood, into something like the invention of justice, and sends one wandering hero on a 10-year second odyssey, back to the quiet island life he had never wanted to leave in the first place, while a single fleeing Trojan family carries the war's memory and its household gods toward a hill in Italy where an empire would one day be founded on the story of a city that lost, and underneath all of that sung and storied history, walk it once more in the other register, the counted rather than the remembered, a real mound above a real strait, dug into carelessly by a man who wanted the myth to be literally true so badly that he was willing to bend the evidence until it was. 9 buried cities, one of them burned by human hands at very nearly the moment the tradition always said Troy fell, a Hittite archive, recovered and deciphered only in the last century, naming a kingdom called Wilusa, and a king named Alaksandu, and a rival power called Ahiyawa, that specialists still argue over identifying with the Greeks themselves. A whole civilization, Hittite and Mycenaean and Egyptian and more, sliding into collapse within the very decades that Troy is thought to have fallen, so that one city's tragedy may always have been only a single visible thread in a much larger unravelling. 4 centuries of total silence, no writing at all, in which the memory of that world had to survive by voice alone, reshaped with every single telling by singers whose art was not memorization but living, formulaic composition. And, at the end of that silence, a script borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, and 2 poems fixed in writing at last, that a fractious, endlessly quarrelling collection of Greek city-states somehow agreed, without any church or king to compel them, to treat as the shared foundation of what it meant to be Greek at all, walk it in that order, sung history and counted history laid side by side, and you can see something that neither telling, offered alone, quite reveals, that this whole enormous tradition, glory and grief and gods and a hollow horse, may well have grown, across 4 dark centuries with no writing to hold it steady, out of something considerably smaller and more ordinary than any single line of Homer ever claims, a border raid, a trade dispute, a siege remembered by the shrinking, frightened survivors of a whole civilization's collapse as the last great, comprehensible catastrophe before the larger, formless, much harder to explain catastrophe that swallowed everything else around it, and that the memory of that one particular fall, alone among 100 other Bronze Age endings the world has simply forgotten, happened to fall into hands, generations later, skilled enough to give it a Hector worth grieving, and an Achilles worth fearing, and a Priam worth kneeling beside, And so it lived, while 100 other equally real catastrophes, never lucky enough to be sung by anyone at all, sank without a trace beneath the same collapse, and left, in the record of human memory, nothing whatsoever behind them. How any of this survived to reach us at all? It is worth pausing, before the last quiet reflections of the night, to ask a question this channel likes to ask of every story it tells, which is simply, how do we actually know any of this, across a gap of 3,000 years, 2 lost scripts, a genuine dark age, and the fall of every single civilization that first told it? And the honest answer is that the survival of this story is very nearly as improbable and very nearly as fragile as the war itself, dependent at every stage on chains of transmission that could easily have snapped, and very nearly did. The poems themselves survived the centuries not as a single original manuscript, carefully preserved in some ancient vault, but as countless individual copies, made and remade by hand, generation after generation, by scribes across the whole span of the ancient and medieval Greek-speaking world, a process of continuous, laborious recopying that was itself a kind of ongoing miracle of cultural will, because every single one of those copies had to be made correctly, or nearly so, by a living human being willing to spend weeks or months reproducing letter by letter a text that already, by the time of the poem's most careful ancient editors, was many centuries old. It was in the great library of Alexandria, in Egypt, in the centuries after Alexander the Great, that scholars first undertook the careful, systematic work of comparing the many variant copies of the Iliad and Odyssey, then in circulation, copies that had drifted across centuries of hand copying and oral memory both, into genuinely different versions of individual lines and passages, and produced something closer to a standard, authoritative text, the direct ancestor, filtered through many further centuries of further copying, of the text scholars still read today. The single most important surviving medieval manuscript of the Iliad, a 10th century copy known to scholars as the Venetus A, sat quietly in the library of St. Mark's in Venice for centuries, its true significance not properly recognised until relatively modern times, and it carries in its margins something that turned out to be almost as valuable as the poem itself, a dense scholarly commentary, copied alongside the main text, drawing on far older, now otherwise lost editions and critical notes from the Alexandrian scholars themselves, so that opening that one manuscript is a little like opening a window 3 separate layers deep, a medieval copy preserving an ancient commentary, preserving fragments of an even more ancient scholarly tradition, each layer a fragile thread that could have been lost at any point along the way and very nearly was. The Hittite archive that gave us Wilusa and Alaksandu and Ahiawa survived by an entirely different and equally improbable route, not through careful, continuous copying at all, but through the opposite, total burial and total forgetting. Tens of thousands of clay tablets baked hard, ironically, by the very fires that destroyed the palace archive that held them, and buried, undisturbed, for more than 3,000 years, in the ruins of a capital city so completely lost to memory that even its location had to be rediscovered in the early 20th century by archaeologists working from scattered second-hand references in other ancient texts, and the language written on those tablets, once unearthed, took decades more of patient, painstaking work by scholars to actually decipher cuneiform signs, recording a language related to no other that had ever been read before, until specialists finally cracked its grammar and could confirm, for the first time in 3,000 years, that the empire whose existence those tablets recorded had once rivaled Egypt itself, and had once, quite possibly, exchanged formal letters about a small vassal kingdom on the coast that Greek poets would one day call Troy. And the Linear B tablets that gave us our glimpse of the anonymous women in the palace textile workshop survived by a third route again, preserved, almost unbelievably, by the same catastrophic fires that destroyed the palaces that produced them, unbaked clay that would ordinarily have crumbled back to dust within a few seasons of rain, instead baked rock hard in the heat of the very conflagration that ended the world, those tablets were recording, so that the Bronze Age collapse, the very disaster this whole night's story has argued may lie behind the myth of Troy's own fall, is also, in a strange and fitting irony, the reason we can read anything of that world's own bureaucratic voice at all, since a palace that burned down preserved its clay archive by accident far better than a palace that simply crumbled slowly over centuries of peaceful abandonment ever could have. It took a young British architect and amateur linguist named Michael Ventris, working largely outside any university post, comparing patterns of recurring symbols with an obsessive self-taught rigour, to finally crack that script's code in 1952. More than half a century after the tablets themselves were first unearthed, and confirming, to the genuine astonishment of scholars who had spent decades assuming the language beneath those symbols would turn out to be something exotic and unrelated to Greek entirely. That the language was, in fact, an early form of Greek itself, the direct linguistic ancestor of the very language Homer would one day compose in, a discovery that connected at a stroke the Bronze Age palace world of Agamemnon's supposed ancestors to the historical Greek world that came after it, closing a gap that scholars had feared, for decades, might simply never be closed at all. Taken together then, this whole 3,000-year-old story reaches us tonight through three entirely separate and entirely improbable chains of survival, a sung tradition carried across 4 centuries of total darkness by voice alone, and then copied, by hand, across another 2,500 years of scribes. A diplomatic archive buried by catastrophe and rediscovered by patient 20th century excavation, and a palace accounting system meant to last no longer than the fiscal year it recorded, preserved by the very fire that ended the civilization it was built to serve. Any one of those 3 chains could have broken, at any point along its length, a single careless scribe, a single undiscovered mound, a single decipherment that never succeeded, and had any of them broken, we would know this story very differently tonight, or perhaps not at all, and it is worth sitting, for a moment, with the sheer improbability of the fact that all 3 held, long enough, against every kind of loss 3,000 years can throw at a story, to let us sit here together tonight and trace the whole shape of it, from a golden apple to a computer virus, in a single unbroken thread. The hill above the strait tonight, it is still there, that mound, on a low rise above the Dardanelles, in what is now northwestern Turkey, and it is worth spending our last few clear-eyed minutes there before we let the story soften, finally, into sleep. Where Schliemann once tore his impatient trench straight down through 3,500 years of layered habitation, there stands today a modern visitor centre, and reconstructed walls that let ordinary travellers walk, for the first time in 3,000 years, along something like the fortifications the poems once praised as God-built, and, a little apart from the excavation itself, a large wooden horse, built for tourists rather than for war, that visitors climb inside and photograph themselves posing from, a monument to a monument, an image of the very device that once ended a city now standing, harmlessly, as the single most popular attraction in a quiet regional town that most of the world would otherwise have no particular reason to visit at all. Archaeologists still work the site, in campaigns considerably more careful and considerably slower than Schliemann's ever were, still turning up fragments that add small, careful corrections to the picture, generations of scholars before them have built, the work of understanding this one hill nowhere near finished, more than a century and a half after the first shovel went into it, and very likely never to be finished completely, since so much of what Schliemann's own impatience destroyed in those first hurried years can never now be recovered, no matter how carefully the layers that remain are sifted. And the poems themselves, meanwhile, are more widely read at this moment, this very night, than at almost any point in their 3,000-year existence. Translated into languages the Bronze Age Aegean never dreamed existed, taught in classrooms on every continent, adapted into films and novels and video games that carry Achilles and Hector and Odysseus to audiences who will never open a printed page of Homer at all, and will know this story anyway, second-hand and third-hand. The way stories in an oral tradition were always meant to travel, changing a little with every single retelling, and somehow, through all that change, remaining recognisably themselves. There is something almost eerie in that continuity. Tonight, something worth sitting with in the quiet, that a story shaped across 4 centuries of total darkness by anonymous singers whose own names did not survive even as well as the names of the heroes they sang about should still be finding new listeners, in new languages, on devices those singers could not have imagined in their wildest invocations of divine power. 3,000 years after the last actual Bronze Age palace that might have inspired it burned to the ground. A note on chance and on choice. It is fair to ask, at the close of a story this old and this strange, the question we have learned to ask at the end of every long story this channel tells: did any of it have to happen the way it came down to us? And the honest answer, as it nearly always is, has 2 halves. There was chance in it, blind and enormous, at nearly every turning. The chance that a genuine, if probably modest, Bronze Age conflict over a strategic strait happened to occur in the exact same narrow window of decades as a civilization-wide collapse, vast enough to make that one conflict feel, to the frightened survivors who remembered it, like the whole world's ending rather than one city's. The chance that the oral tradition which carried that memory through 4 centuries of total darkness happened to be inherited, near the very end of its long unwritten life, by a singer or a school of singers of sufficient genius to shape it into something so humanly true that later ages could not let it go. The chance that the Greek world, of all the many peoples who might have adopted and adapted the Phoenician alphabet, happened to do so at more or less the right moment to catch that oral tradition just before it might otherwise have kept drifting poem after poem, generation after generation, into some other, less enduring shape entirely, or simply faded, the way 10,000 other oral epics from 10,000 other vanished peoples have faded, into nothing. The chance that a wealthy, restless, morally flexible German businessman happened to develop, in the middle of the 19th century, an obsession specific enough, and a fortune large enough to dig, however clumsily, into exactly the right mound. And the chance, later still, that a young architect with no university post and no formal training in ancient languages happened to have exactly the right cast of mind to crack a script that had defeated professional scholars for half a century. Shuffle any one of those cards differently, and this story, or at least our knowledge of any truth that might lie beneath it, looks entirely different tonight, if it exists for us to tell at all. But chance, as we've said on other nights, in this same quiet room, only ever deals the hand, and the rest, the part that actually shaped the story you have spent tonight listening to, was choice, made and remade across 3,000 years by people who never met each other and never coordinated with each other in any way beyond the simple, repeated act of deciding this story was worth passing on. It was the choice of singer after singer across 4 dark centuries to keep this particular tale in their repertoire rather than let it lapse into the same silence that swallowed whatever songs those singers must also have known about 100 other Bronze Age conflicts we will now never hear of at all. It was the choice of the poet, or poets, who finally shaped the oral tradition into the Iliad and the Odyssey, to give Hector a wife who loved him and a fear he could not quite master, rather than making him a simple villain for Greek audiences to hate without complication. A choice that cost that poet nothing in the moment and bought the whole tradition 3,000 years of continued relevance. Because a story with real grief on both sides of it never stops finding readers ready to recognise their own grief inside it. It was the choice of the Alexandrian scholars to painstakingly compare variant manuscripts rather than let the text drift into a dozen incompatible versions, with no way to tell which, if any, deserved to be called authoritative. It was the choice, centuries later, of an Athenian playwright to put the enslaved women of a 3,000-year-old defeat on his own city's stage in the middle of his own city's very similar, very contemporary atrocity, refusing his own audience the comfort of watching an old story without also being made to look at a new one. And it was, even in its own flawed and self-interested way, the choice of an ambitious 19th century businessman to spend his own considerable fortune chasing a childhood obsession that every credentialed scholar of his own age had told him was a fool's errand. A choice made for reasons that had rather more to do with his own vanity than with any pure love of truth, and that nonetheless, however clumsily, however destructively in places, pulled a real Bronze Age world back up out of the dirt where 3,000 years of silence had buried it. No single one of those choices, made alone, would have been enough to carry the story the whole distance from a Bronze Age hillside to the device this is playing on tonight. It took all of them together, choice after choice after choice, made by people separated from each other by centuries and continents, and the total absence of any way to know that anyone else, before or after them, was making a choice that rhymed with their own. And it is that accumulation, more than any single dramatic turning point, that this channel has learned, across every long story it has ever told, actually explains how the deepest and most durable human memories survive, not by one great preserving act, but by an unbroken, largely uncoordinated chain of people across an almost unimaginable span of time, each one deciding, in their own small way, that this particular story, out of all the stories they might have let go instead, was the one worth the trouble of carrying just a little further into the dark, the last watch of the night, and so we come, at last, to the end, and to the quiet hours, and perhaps it is only right to spend the last of them where we began, on that empty beach below the walls, in the hour just before the horse was ever opened. It is still there tonight in its way, that hill above the strait, red earth and broken stone under whatever moon happens to be hanging over the Dardanelles this particular midnight, the reconstructed walls standing pale in the dark, the wooden horse built for tourists standing empty and unguarded now, no army hidden inside it, no old priest hurling a spear into its flank, no princess screaming a warning that no one in 3,000 years has ever quite managed to fully believe. Somewhere beneath that quiet modern hillside, in the compressed and tangled layers the archaeologists have spent a century and a half patiently reading, there is still, we believe, a floor of ash where a real fire once burned, on a real night, for reasons that were almost certainly stranger and smaller and less glamorous than any wooden horse. A fire that a frightened, grieving generation, watching their whole interconnected Bronze Age world come apart around them, for reasons no one could fully explain, needed, more than they perhaps even understood at the time, to make sense of, and so they gave it a cause large enough to hold their grief, a beauty beyond reckoning, a debt of honour that could not go unanswered. 10 years of the finest men 2 civilizations could produce, spent and spent again against a single set of walls, until at last the walls came down. None of them, that herder's fire on a mountainside in another of our stories, that priest with his spear, that old king reaching for armour his own strength could no longer carry, could have imagined where their small, real, human losses would end up travelling, sung by firelight through 4 centuries with no writing at all, to hold the word steady, carried across a sea of forgetting, on nothing but the patient, unpaid labour of voice teaching, voice, caught at last by a stylus and a wax tablet somewhere in the 8th century before Christ, copied and argued over and edited by scholars in a library beside the sea in Egypt, buried again for centuries in monastery libraries that barely knew what they were guarding, rediscovered by the restless curiosity of the European Renaissance, dug for and half destroyed, and finally properly excavated by men who wanted so badly for it to be true that they were willing to bend the evidence, and eventually men patient enough not to need to bend it at all. Achilles' rage, and Hector's fear on the wall, and Priam's hand reaching for the hand that killed his son, and Andromache watching her whole world thrown down from a tower, and Cassandra screaming true things to a city built by no fault of her own, never to hear her. All of it, the golden apple and the wooden horse and the 4 bankrupt centuries in between, existed for these 3,000 years for a single purpose in the end. The only purpose any story this old ever really serves: to let people very far away in times and places its first singers could never have pictured sit quietly in the dark and feel, for a little while, less alone with their own losses. The war is scattered now beyond all gathering, its heroes' names outliving every fact that might once have pinned them to a single real skirmish on a single real evening. Its city rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again 9 separate times before settling at last into the quiet ruin tourists walk through today with cameras rather than spears. And its lesson, if a story this old and this tangled can be said to leave behind anything so tidy as a single lesson, is perhaps only this: that human beings have never needed a war to be simple, or its cause worthy, or its ending fair, in order to need it told, and told well, and told for as long as there are people left willing to listen in the dark. Somewhere tonight, on that low hill above a strait that still carries ships between 2 seas, exactly as it did 3,000 years ago, the wind moves over ground that has forgotten far more than it ever managed to keep, and the story goes on being told anyway, in this room, in your own tired mind, the way it has been told in 10,000 the other rooms across 10,000 other nights before this one. History does not end, and it does not finish paying what it owes. It only grows quiet and hands its weight to whoever is still awake to carry it, and waits to see what the next voice will choose to keep. If you are still awake out there, thank you for keeping me company through the whole long journey, through the golden apple and the 10 years of siege, the wrath of Achilles and the mercy in Priam's tent, the horse and the burning city, and the long scattering home, the buried tablets, and the patient, imperfect century and a half it took to bring even this much of the truth back up into the light. There is a kind of peace, I think, in a story old enough to have outlived every single person who ever fought in it, and every single person who first sang about it, and every single empire that ever tried to claim it as its own particular inheritance. The peace of watching even the mightiest griefs of the ancient world soften, slowly, across 3,000 years, into telling, into a voice in a dark room, keeping company with whoever happens to need it tonight. Whatever is pressing on you this evening, it too is smaller, in the end, than the fall of a great city, and it too will pass through its own long siege and its own quiet dawn, and become, one day, only a story someone else is kind enough to tell. Another story will be waiting on the screen whenever you're ready for it, and it will keep until morning. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below, and perhaps your location and your local time, so that some other sleepless soul, somewhere far away, might know they are not the only one awake beneath the dark. But for now, the horse is empty, and the fires have gone out, and there is nothing left tonight but the quiet. Close your eyes, and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.